The Mafia boss hurled insults at Sofia in Italian, assuming she couldn't understand a word. But when she whispered his dead wife's name in perfect Calabrese dialect, the color drained from his face. In that moment, she realized she'd either saved her life or signed her death warrant. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The crystal wine glass shattered against the marble floor 3 inches from my feet, red liquid spreading across the white tile like arterial spray. I didn't flinch. 5 years of waitressing in New York's most exclusive Italian restaurants had taught me that the truly dangerous men never threw things at you. They threw things near you, a calculated display of power that demanded you acknowledge their dominance without giving them the satisfaction of seeing fear. Questa ragazza stupida non sa nemmeno differenza tra Barolo e Barbaresco. The man's voice carried across Ristorante Lucia with the kind of contempt that made other diners look away quickly, pretending they hadn't witnessed anything. This stupid girl doesn't even know the difference between Barolo and Barbaresco. What he didn't know was that I understood every word. My mother had been born in Calabria before immigrating to Brooklyn at 17, and she'd raised me speaking the southern dialect at home while my father insisted on English everywhere else. By the time I was 10, I was fluent in both languages and skilled at pretending I only spoke one when it served my purposes. That particular survival skill had proven invaluable in my line of work. I bent to collect the shattered glass with steady hands, my black uniform dress perfectly pressed despite the dinner rush, my dark hair still smooth in its low bun, even though we were 3 hours into service. At 28, I'd perfected the art of invisible competence, kind that made customers feel served without ever really noticing the server. But this man had noticed me from the moment I'd approached his table, and not in the way that usually preceded generous tips or polite conversation. Signor Marchetti had arrived at 8 o'clock without a reservation, which should have been impossible on a Friday night when Lucia's was booked solid for weeks in advance. But Marco, our general manager, had materialized from his office within seconds of the man's entrance, personally escorting him to the best table in the house, the corner booth with views of both the dining room and the street beyond the floor to ceiling windows, the kind of positioning that suggested paranoia or professional necessity, possibly both. Everything about Dante Marchetti screamed old money and older violence. His suit was bespoke, probably Brioni, fitted perfectly across shoulders that suggested he spent serious time maintaining physical conditioning despite being somewhere in his mid-40s. The watch on his wrist cost more than I'd make in 5 years, even with tips from Lucia's wealthy clientele. But it was his eyes that told the real story, dark and assessing, conducting constant surveillance of the room with the kind of practiced awareness that came from years of expecting threats. I'd served men like him before. New York's fine dining scene attracted a certain type of customer, the ones whose wealth came from businesses they never discussed, who paid in cash and left tips calculated to ensure loyalty without attracting attention. They moved through legitimate society like sharks through shallow water, barely concealed predators that everyone recognized but no one acknowledged directly. The wine I'd poured for him was exactly what he'd ordered. Barolo, a 2015 vintage from one of Piedmont's most respected producers. I'd studied Italian wines extensively, part of the sommelier certification I'd been working toward for the past 2 years. But Marchetti had tasted it, announced it was wrong with the kind of certainty that brooked no argument, and demanded I bring Barbaresco instead, 2 completely different wines from the same region. When I'd politely explained the distinction, suggesting that perhaps he'd prefer the Barbaresco for his next course, he'd responded by hurling the glass at my feet while insulting my intelligence in Italian. He assumed I couldn't understand. The other diners had frozen, conversations dying mid-sentence as they processed the violence underlying his controlled fury. In the kitchen, I knew the staff would be listening, wondering if I'd handle this the way Sofia, our head server, always insisted we should, with dignity and professional distance. Mi scusi, signore. My Italian emerged smooth and accentless, the Calabrese inflections my mother had taught me carefully suppressed in favor of the more refined Tuscan pronunciation that marked educated speakers. I apologize for any confusion. Let me bring you the Barbaresco you prefer, and of course there will be no charge for either bottle. The change in Marchetti's expression was subtle but unmistakable. His eyes narrowed slightly, reassessing me with the kind of sharp intelligence that missed nothing. Around us, the restaurant's ambient noise slowly resumed as other patrons realized the confrontation had de-escalated, though several continued watching our table with the morbid fascination of people witnessing a car accident in slow motion. To parle Italiano. His statement carried no warmth, just cold evaluation. You speak Italian? Signor, mia madre, di Calabria. Yes, sir. My mother is from Calabria. Something flickered across his features, too quick to identify before his mask of control returned. He leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming once against the white tablecloth in a gesture that seemed almost unconscious, a tell that suggested he was processing information that mattered more than he wanted to reveal. Calabrese. The word hung between us, weighted with implications I couldn't quite decipher. And yet you work here, serving wine to tourists who wouldn't know sanjovis from vinegar. The contempt in his voice wasn't directed at me this time, but at the restaurant itself, at the business of hospitality that required people like me to smile and serve people who understood nothing about the culture they were consuming. There was something personal in his disdain, something that went deeper than mere snobbery. It's honest work, I replied, keeping my tone carefully neutral. And Restaurante Lucia serves authentic regional cuisine to people who appreciate it. Not everyone who dines here is a tourist. His smile was sharp as broken glass. No, some of us are just ghosts, haunting the places where we used to be happy. The sudden vulnerability in his statement caught me off guard. This was the same man who'd just thrown a wine glass in my direction, who radiated controlled menace like radiation from a barely contained reactor. But for just a moment, I'd seen something else beneath the surface. Grief carved so deep it had become part of his foundational architecture. I should have walked away then, should have brought him his Barbaresco, finished my shift, and forgotten about Dante Marchetti and his expensive suits and his carefully controlled violence. But something about that glimpse of pain beneath the power made me hesitate, made me see him not just as a dangerous customer, but as a human being carrying wounds that probably would never fully heal. Signore, I said quietly, leaning forward slightly so my voice wouldn't carry to nearby tables. The Barolo you originally ordered, it's from the same vineyard where my mother worked before she came to America. She used to tell me stories about the hills where those grapes grew, about the families who'd been making wine there for centuries. When I pour that particular vintage, I remember her story. I remember her. Marchetti's expression shifted again, something complex and painful moving behind his eyes. His hand, which had been resting on the table with tense precision, relaxed fractionally, fingers spreading slightly as if releasing tension he'd been holding for far too long. Your mother, he said slowly. She is ... She passed away 3 years ago, cancer, but I still remember everything she taught me about where she came from, about the food and wine and the way people in Calabria understood that some things matter more than money or power. I watched him process this information, saw the way it landed somewhere vulnerable inside the armor he'd constructed around himself. In that moment, I understood something about Dante Marchetti that probably should have frightened me, but somehow didn't. He was a man who'd lost something irreplaceable, and that loss had transformed him into someone who kept the entire world at a careful distance, testing everyone who came close with casual cruelty to see if they were worthy of getting closer. The name came to me then, not from anything I'd heard or been told, but from pure instinct honed by years of reading customers and understanding the stories they didn't speak aloud. I thought about the ring on his left hand, still worn despite obvious years of widowhood. I thought about the way he'd called himself a ghost, haunting happy places. I thought about the particular quality of his grief, the kind that came from violent loss rather than natural death. And I thought about the whisper I'd overheard in the kitchen 3 weeks earlier. Marco speaking urgently on the phone about a VIP customer we'd need to accommodate. Someone whose wife had been killed years ago in a restaurant not unlike this one. Someone who still came to Italian restaurants as a form of penance or remembrance or both. I bent down to retrieve the last shard of broken glass, then straightened and moved close enough to his table that only he would hear my next words. Close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair, the way his jaw tightened as he waited for whatever I would say next. Caterina, I whispered. Il suo nome era Caterina. Her name was Caterina. Its color drained from Dante Marchetti's face. His hand, which had been reaching for his water glass, froze midway across the table. For 3 heartbeats, he didn't breathe, didn't move, existing in a moment of shock so profound it was almost painful to witness. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes held something I hadn't seen before. Not anger or contempt or cold calculation, but recognition. The kind that came from being truly seen by another human being. From having your most carefully guarded pain acknowledged by someone who had no right to know it existed. The restaurant continued its elegant rhythm around us. Servers moving between tables with practiced grace. Diners laughing and talking and living their uncomplicated lives. But at this table, in this moment, something had shifted fundamentally. I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross, had spoken a name that changed everything between us. And as I stood there holding broken glass and meeting the eyes of a man who could probably destroy my life with a single phone call, I realized that my mother had taught me something more valuable than Italian wine regions or regional dialects. She'd taught me that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could offer another person was not defiance or submission, but understanding, kind that acknowledged their humanity even when they'd spent years trying to bury it beneath power and violence and carefully constructed armor. Come, Marchetti said finally, his voice rough with emotions he was struggling to contain. Come, lei sa, how do you know? And that was the question I couldn't answer, at least not in any way that would make sense to either of us. The truth was I didn't know how I knew, not in any rational way that would satisfy a man like Dante Marchetti, whose world operated on concrete intelligence and verifiable facts. What I had was instinct, pattern recognition honed by years of studying people who worked hard to hide their true selves, and a peculiar gift my mother had called seeing beneath the surface. surface. She'd possessed it too, that ability to understand the unspoken stories people carried, to recognize pain even when it wore expensive suits and commanded respect through carefully controlled menace. I read people, I said finally, still holding his gaze despite every survival instinct screaming at me to look away, to defer, to remember my place in the hierarchy that governed interactions between servers and powerful men. It's not magic or investigation. I just pay attention to the things most people miss. The way you still wear your wedding ring even though she's been gone for years. The way you asked for this specific table, the one positioned exactly like the corner booth at Bella, not in Little Italy where she was killed. The way you come to Italian restaurants and create confrontations with the staff, as if you're trying to recreate that night, trying to understand what you missed, what signs you failed to see before someone decided to take her from you. Marchetti's hand had moved to his jacket, and I understood with crystal clarity that beneath the fine Italian wool, he was carrying a weapon. The knowledge should have terrified me, but somehow it didn't. I'd already crossed the point where fear would have saved me. Now there was only forward motion, whatever consequences that might bring. "You have no right," he said quietly, each word precise and sharp as a surgical blade. "No right to speak of her, to presume to understand what happened, to use her name like you knew her. You're right. I didn't know her. But I know grief, Signora. I know what it looks like when someone can't let go of the past, because letting go would mean accepting that the person they loved is truly gone. My mother died in my arms in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and despair. For months afterward, I'd go to the grocery store where she used to shop, stand in the aisles where she'd taught me to select the best produce, trying to feel close to her again, trying to pretend that if I just stood in the right places, followed the right patterns, maybe she'd materialize beside me one more time." Something shifted in his expression, the cold calculation giving way to something more complex. Around us, the restaurant continued its elegant dance. But I was acutely aware of how isolated we'd become, existing in a bubble of shared understanding that excluded the rest of the world. "Bella Knott." His voice had changed, becoming softer, more vulnerable. "You know about Bella Knott. Everyone in the industry knows the story. A shooting in Little Italy 7 years ago. A prominent businessman and his wife dining in a corner booth when masked gunmen came through the front entrance. She threw herself in front of him, took 3 bullets that were meant for his chest. She died before the ambulance arrived, bleeding out on the floor of a restaurant while her husband held her and their dinner went cold on the table. I'd been working at a different restaurant that night, a bistro in Midtown that catered to tourists and theater crowds. But the news had spread through New York's restaurant community like wildfire, not just because of the violence, which was shocking enough, but because of the implications. Bella Knott had been owned by the Castellano family, one of the old guard crime organizations that maintained an uneasy peace with their rivals through careful territorial agreements. The attack had been a declaration of war disguised as a targeted assassination, and the aftermath had reshaped the entire landscape of organized crime in New York. Caterina Marchetti had been collateral damage in a conflict she probably didn't fully understand. She'd married a man who lived in the shadows, built his fortune on enterprises that existed outside the law, and maintained power through a combination of strategic intelligence and calculated violence. But by all accounts, she'd been genuinely innocent, a civilian who'd fallen in love with the wrong man and paid the ultimate price for that mistake. Marco was watching from across the dining room, his expression carefully neutral but his posture tense. He understood that something significant was happening at table 12, something that could have ramifications far beyond a difficult customer and a broken wine glass. I gave him a subtle nod, the signal we'd developed to indicate I had the situation under control. Though I wasn't entirely sure that was true, Marchetti was still studying me with that unsettling intensity, as if trying to solve an equation that didn't follow normal mathematical principles. His hand had moved away from his jacket, resting once again on the white tablecloth, but the tension hadn't left his shoulders. "What is your name?" he asked finally. Sophia Russo. Russo. Calabrese? My mother's family? My father was from Brooklyn, 3rd-generation Italian-American. He owned a construction company, legitimate business, no connections to anything that required looking over your shoulder or keeping guns under your jacket. The last part came out sharper than I'd intended, carrying an edge of judgment I should have kept buried. But Marchetti just smiled, a real smile this time, touched with dark humor. "Your father was wise. This world, it destroys everything beautiful that enters it. If I could go back, if I could choose differently, I would have been a construction worker or a teacher or anything else that would have kept Caterina safe. But you can't go back. None of us can. No, we can only move forward carrying our ghosts with us, trying not to add to their number." A commotion near the kitchen entrance interrupted our conversation. 2 men in expensive suits had entered through the service corridor, moving with the kind of purposeful authority that suggested they weren't here for dinner. Marco intercepted them immediately, his body language deferential but concerned. One of the men leaned close, speaking urgently into Marco's ear while keeping his eyes fixed on Marchetti's table. Something was wrong. I'd worked in enough restaurants, served enough customers who operated outside normal legal boundaries to recognize the warning sign. The way the new arrivals positioned themselves with clear sight lines to both exits. The way other diners suddenly found reasons to request their checks, responding to instincts they probably couldn't articulate but couldn't ignore. The way Marchetti's entire demeanor had shifted from vulnerable reminiscence to predatory alertness. "Sophia," he said quietly, not looking at me but scanning the room with practiced efficiency, "I need you to do exactly as I say. Walk to the kitchen. Tell Marco that Santoro's people are here and I need the back exit clear in the next 60 seconds. Do not run. Do not draw attention. Just walk naturally as if you're simply checking on an order. Signora, I don't understand what's happening. You don't need to understand. You need to trust me and move. Now." The command in his voice overrode my confusion. I turned away from his table, forcing my legs to carry me toward the kitchen with the same measured pace I'd use for any routine task. My heart hammered against my ribs, adrenaline flooding my system with fight-or-flight chemicals that made everything seem simultaneously too sharp and slightly unreal. Marco met me halfway across the dining room, his face pale beneath his carefully maintained composure. "What did he say to you?" "He said to tell you Santoro's people are here. He needs the back exit clear in 60 seconds. Madonna Santissima." Marco's whispered prayer carried genuine fear. "Get to the kitchen. Stay there. Don't come out until someone tells you it's safe." "Who's Santoro?" "No one you want to know about. Go." I pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen where the usual organized chaos of dinner service had given way to tense silence. The line cooks stood at their stations, knives and pans temporarily abandoned as they processed whatever information had filtered back from the dining. Our head chef Giovanni, a 60-year-old former Marine who'd seen combat in Iraq, had positioned himself near the back exit, his phone in one hand, his other hand resting on something I couldn't see but could definitely imagine. "What's happening out there, Sophia?" he asked without taking his eyes off the door. "I don't know exactly, but I think we're about to witness something no one should see. Then maybe you should head home for the night. Take the service exit to the alley. My car's parked 2 blocks north. Keys are in my locker. Come back for it tomorrow when things have calmed down." The offer was generous and sensible, the kind of practical escape route I should have accepted immediately. But something kept me rooted to the spot near the door. Some combination of morbid curiosity and genuine concern for what might happen to Dante Marchetti in the next few minutes. He'd shown me vulnerability, had let me see beneath his carefully constructed armor. Walking away felt like abandoning someone who'd trusted me with something precious, even if that trust had been involuntary. Through the small window in the kitchen door, I watched the scene unfold in the dining room like a carefully choreographed dance that everyone knew would end in violence. The 2 men who'd entered through the service corridor had been joined by a third, this one larger, more obviously dangerous, with the kind of face that suggested he'd broken bones professionally for most of his adult life. Marchetti remained seated at his table, the picture of casual unconcern, though I could see the way his right hand had disappeared beneath the tablecloth. The standoff lasted maybe 30 seconds, both sides assessing, calculating odds, considering consequences. Then the largest of the 3 men made a mistake. He moved his hand toward his jacket, reaching for whatever weapon he'd brought to this confrontation. What happened next unfolded so quickly I almost missed it. Marchetti rose from his seat with fluid grace, his right hand emerging from beneath the table holding a compact pistol that seemed to materialize from nowhere. The shot was impossibly loud in the enclosed space of the restaurant, the sound punching through the elegant ambiance like a fist through silk. The large man dropped, clutching his shoulder, his weapon clattering across the marble floor. The other 2 froze, hands raised in immediate surrender, whatever orders they'd been given, whatever plan they'd devised. It hadn't accounted for Marchetti being armed and willing to shoot first. Around them, the remaining diners had either ducked beneath tables or were scrambling toward exits, their expensive meals abandoned in favor of basic survival instincts. Marco appeared from somewhere, moving with surprising confidence given the circumstances. He spoke to the 2 standing men in rapid Italian, too fast for me to follow completely, but I caught enough words to understand he was negotiating their departure. They'd leave immediately, taking their wounded companion with them. In exchange, Marchetti wouldn't kill all 3 of them right here in Ristorante Lucia, creating the kind of publicity that would be bad for everyone's business. The wounded man was hauled to his feet by his companions, blood dripping from his shoulder in a pattern that would require serious cleaning later. They moved toward the service exit, passing within 10 feet of where I stood watching through the kitchen window. The large man's eyes met mine for just a moment, and I saw something in them that chilled me to the bone. Not pain from his injury, but promise. A guarantee that this wasn't over, that someone would pay for tonight's humiliation. And it might not be the man who'd actually pulled the trigger. Then they were gone, disappeared into the New York night, leaving behind an elegant restaurant transformed into a crime scene. Marchetti stood at his table, weapon still in hand, surveying the damage with the calm assessment of someone conducting a routine business evaluation. When his eyes found mine through the kitchen window, something passed between us. an acknowledgement that we'd both crossed lines we couldn't uncross. He walked toward the kitchen, moving through the chaos of the dining room with unhurried confidence. When he pushed through the swinging doors, Giovanni stepped forward, positioning himself between Marchetti and the rest of the staff in a gesture of protection that was probably futile but deeply appreciated. "I need to leave," Marchetti said, addressing Giovanni but keeping his eyes on me. "Santoro's people will report back to him within the hour. He'll send more men, better prepared next time. Anyone who stays in this building after I leave becomes a potential target. I suggest you close for the night. Send your people home, and don't reopen until you're certain it's safe." "And when will that be?" Giovanni asked, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "When Santoro's dead or I am, probably within the next 48 hours. The casual way he discussed his own potential death sent ice through my veins. This was his reality, had been for years. Every dinner could be his last. Every restaurant could become his tomb. And he'd invited me to see behind the curtain, to understand the price he paid for power, and the way his wife's murder had transformed him into someone who expected death around every corner. "Sophia," he said, finally looking at me directly, "walk me to my car." "Signore, I should probably stay here," helped Giovanni close down the restaurant properly. That wasn't a request. Giovanni's hand moved to my shoulder, a protective gesture that spoke volumes about his assessment of the situation. "She's not part of this," he said to Marchetti, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from military service and decades of managing difficult situations. "Whatever business you have with Santoro, leave her out of it." Marchetti's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened fractionally. "I'm not dragging her into anything. I'm ensuring she survives the night. Santoro's men saw her watching from the kitchen. They'll assume she witnessed details that could be useful to law enforcement or a rival family. That makes her a liability they'll want to eliminate." The words hit me like physical blows. In the space of one evening, I'd gone from anonymous waitress to potential target, all because I'd understood too much about a man I should have kept at professional distance. My mother's gift for reading people, for seeing beneath surfaces, had finally betrayed me in the worst possible way. "How long?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "How long until I'm not a liability anymore? Until this situation resolves? Days? Maybe weeks. Depends on how quickly Santoro decides to escalate or negotiate. And if I refuse to come with you, if I just go home, pretend tonight never happened, hope they forget about me?" Marchetti pulled out his phone, typed something quickly, then turned the screen toward me. The image showed a young woman, maybe 25, with dark hair and an easy smile. She was sitting at a cafe, completely unaware someone was photographing her. Then you end up like Maria Constantino. She was a bartender at Vesuvio's 2 years ago. Wrong place, wrong time, saw something she wasn't supposed to see. Told herself the same thing you're thinking right now, that if she just went about her normal life, everyone would forget she existed. What happened to her? They found her in the East River 3 weeks later. Santoro's people are thorough. They don't leave loose ends. The casual way he discussed murder, as if describing a simple business transaction, should have repulsed me. Instead, it crystallized something I'd been avoiding acknowledging. This wasn't hypothetical danger or paranoid overreaction. This was genuine, immediate threat to my continued existence. And the man offering protection was the same one whose presence had created the danger in the first place. Giovanni squeezed my shoulder once, then released me. "Go," he said quietly. "I'll handle things here. Call me when you can." I nodded, unable to form words past the fear constricting my throat. Marchetti moved toward the back exit with that same unhurried confidence, and I followed, acutely aware of how this simple action was changing the trajectory of my entire life. Behind us, the kitchen staff watched in silence, their faces reflecting various combinations of concern, fear, and the kind of resignation that came from working in an industry where power operated by rules most people never saw. The alley behind Ristorante Lucia was dark and narrow, the kind of space that appeared in crime dramas right before something terrible happened. A black Mercedes idled near the service entrance, its engine a low purr in the urban night. The driver was built like a professional heavyweight, his suit stretched across shoulders that suggested serious gym time, possibly pharmaceutical enhancement. "This is Vincent," Marchetti said as we approached the car. "He's worked for my family for 15 years. You can trust him with your life," which is convenient since that's exactly what you'll be doing. Vincent nodded at me with professional courtesy that didn't quite mask his assessment. He was calculating my potential as both asset and liability, determining whether I represented value worth protecting or a problem that would eventually require permanent resolution. I'd seen that same evaluation in the eyes of bouncers at clubs, security guards at upscale events, anyone whose job involved determining who belonged and who needed to be removed. "Miss Russo will be staying at the Riverside property," Marchetti told Vincent as we settled into the back seat. "Full security protocol. No one gets close without my explicit authorization." "Understood." Vincent pulled away from the curb with smooth precision, navigating the narrow alley before merging into late-night Manhattan traffic. "What about the restaurant situation?" "Marco's handling it. Local precinct will file reports, conduct interviews, find absolutely nothing useful. The shooter will remain unidentified, the victims will refuse to press charges, and by tomorrow morning it'll be just another unsolved incident in a city full of unsolveds." I stared out the window, watching familiar streets pass by with surreal detachment. Everything looked the same as it had this morning when I'd taken the subway to work. Chatting with Carmen about her daughter's upcoming quinceañera, and complaining about the summer heat. But I'd crossed into a different world now, one where shootings got swept under bureaucratic carpets and witnesses disappeared into rivers. You're very quiet, Marchetti observed. Most people have questions after experiencing what you just experienced. I'm processing, trying to understand how my life went from normal to nightmare in the space of one dinner service. It went from normal to nightmare the moment you spoke Katerina's name. That's when you stopped being invisible staff and became someone I noticed, someone Santoro's men noticed watching me. In my world, being noticed is often fatal, and maybe you should have let me stay invisible, maybe, but then you would have just been another casualty when Santoro sent his next team to finish what tonight's team started. At least this way you have a chance of surviving. The logic was sound, even if I hated every part of it. We drove north through Manhattan, the city lights creating patterns of shadow and illumination across Marchetti's face. He'd put away the gun somewhere I hadn't noticed, but his posture remained alert, eyes continuously scanning traffic for potential threats. This was his permanent state of being, I realized. Always watching, always calculating, never truly relaxing, even in moments that should have been safe. Tell me about Katerina, I said suddenly. Not how she died, everyone knows that story. Tell me about who she was when she was alive. He was silent for so long I thought he'd refuse. Then quietly, almost reluctantly, he began to speak. She taught elementary school, 3rd grade. She believed children at that age were still innocent enough to be shaped into good people before the world corrupted them. Every September, she'd spend her own money buying supplies for students whose families couldn't afford them. She'd stay late tutoring kids who were falling behind, making sure no one got left in the dark just because they learned differently than their peers. The image he painted was so at odds with the violence of her death that it created cognitive dissonance. A woman who nurtured children, who believed in fundamental human goodness, had married a man who operated outside every moral boundary most people recognized. How did you meet her? At a charity fundraiser for the school where she taught. I donated money, significant money, the kind that bought naming rights to new buildings and ensured generous tax deductions. She cornered me during cocktails, asked if I'd be willing to come speak to her class about entrepreneurship and business success. She had no idea who I really was, what my business actually involved. She just saw a successful man who might inspire her students to dream bigger. And you went? I went. Stood in front of 38-year-olds and talked about hard work and determination and all the myths we tell ourselves about how success happens. She watched from the back of the classroom with this expression of pure joy, like I was doing something profoundly meaningful instead of lying to children about how the world actually works. But you kept seeing her. I couldn't stop. She had this light in her, this genuine belief that people were fundamentally good if you just gave them the right opportunities. I knew being with me would eventually destroy that light, that my world would corrupt everything pure about her, but I was selfish enough to let it happen anyway. Selfish enough to marry her knowing that one day someone would use her to hurt me, and they did. And I've spent every day since then trying to figure out if I'm avenging her death or just prolonging my own punishment for getting her killed. The raw honesty in his voice created an intimacy I wasn't prepared for. This was the real Dante Marchetti, stripped of the calculated menace and cold control. Just a man carrying guilt so profound it had become part of his identity, shaping every decision he made and every relationship he formed. The Riverside property turned out to be a penthouse apartment in a building that probably cost more per month than I made in a year. The lobby was all marble and modern art, the kind of space designed to intimidate people who didn't belong. But Vincent moved through it with easy familiarity, nodding at the night security guard who buzzed us through to the private elevator without asking for identification. The penthouse occupied the entire 42nd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the Hudson River and the New Jersey skyline beyond. The furnishings were expensive but impersonal, the kind of decorator-chosen aesthetic that spoke of wealth without revealing anything about the owner's actual taste or personality. This was a safe house, a temporary refuge that could be abandoned without regret when the next crisis demanded relocation. Guest bedroom is down the hall, second door on the left, Marchetti said, loosening his tie with the first casual gesture I'd seen from him all evening. There are clothes in the closet, basic toiletries in the bathroom. Vincent will be stationed outside the main entrance. No one comes in or out without my knowledge. And you? Where will you be? Handling the situation, making calls, ensuring that by morning Santoro understands the cost of sending people after me will be significantly higher than he's prepared to pay. You mean you're gonna kill people? The bluntness of my statement didn't seem to offend him. He just smiled, that sharp, dangerous smile I was beginning to recognize. I'm going to solve a problem using the methods my world understands. If that results in casualties, then those casualties made choices that led them to this moment. Same as you made choices tonight that led you here. I didn't choose any of this. You chose to speak Italian when you could have stayed silent. You chose to read me well enough to know my wife's name. You chose to look through that kitchen window instead of taking Giovanni's offer to leave. We always have choices, Sophia. We just don't always like the consequences those choices create. He was right, of course. Every decision I'd made tonight had been my own, driven by curiosity and compassion, and the particular curse of being able to see people's pain even when they tried to hide it. My mother had warned me about this, told me that the gift of understanding others came with the burden of being unable to ignore their suffering, but I'd never imagined that burden would manifest as being trapped in a penthouse with a mob boss who discussed murder with the same casual efficiency most people used to discuss dinner plans. Get some rest, Marchetti said, heading toward what I assumed was his office. Tomorrow, things get complicated. More complicated than being targeted by a crime family because I witnessed a shooting in a restaurant. Significantly more complicated, because now I have to decide what to do with you. Can't keep you here indefinitely. Can't send you home until Santoro's dealt with. Can't trust you won't go to the police, though I suspect you're smart enough to understand why that would be fatal for both of us. I'm not going to the police. No, most people in your situation would at least consider it. Witness protection, new identity, chance to escape all of this and start fresh somewhere safe. Witness protection only works if the people hunting you eventually stop looking. Something tells me Santoro doesn't give up easily. He doesn't. Which brings us back to the original problem. What to do with Sophia Russo? Waitress who knows too much and has nowhere safe to go. Maybe I could help you. My psychology degree, my ability to read people, surely that has value in your world. You said yourself I understood things most people miss. Marchetti turned back to look at me, his expression unreadable. You're suggesting I employ you? Turn a waitress into what exactly? A behavioral consultant for organized crime? You need to understand your enemies, predict their moves, identify who can be trusted and who's planning betrayal. I could do that. I'm good at it. Tonight proved that. Tonight proved you're observant and brave. It didn't prove you're capable of operating in a world where wrong assessments get people killed. Then teach me. Train me. Give me a chance to be useful instead of just being a liability you're stuck protecting. The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications neither of us was quite ready to acknowledge. Outside the windows, the city sparkled with a million lights, each one representing lives being lived by people who had no idea how close they constantly were to the darkness that existed beneath civilization's surface. Finally, Marchetti spoke, his voice carrying something that might have been respect or might have been resignation. We'll discuss it tomorrow, after I've handled Santoro and we're both still alive to have the conversation. He disappeared into his office, leaving me alone in a penthouse that felt simultaneously like sanctuary and prison. I walked to the guest bedroom, found clothes exactly my size hanging in the closet, a detail that suggested Marchetti's people had been very thorough in their background research. They knew where I lived, what I wore, probably everything about my life down to my shoe size and preferred coffee order. I should have been terrified, should have been planning escape routes and considering whether witness protection might actually be worth the risk. Instead, I found myself thinking about the way Marchetti had talked about Caterina, the genuine pain beneath his controlled exterior, the way his world operated by brutal rules that most people never had to acknowledge existed. My mother had always said I was drawn to broken things, that I saw damage in others and couldn't resist trying to understand it, to contextualize it, maybe even to heal it. Dante Marchetti was the most broken person I'd ever encountered, shattered by grief and rebuilt into something dangerous and compelling in equal measure, and somehow, impossibly, I wanted to understand him better, wanted to prove I could be useful in his world, wanted to survive not just this immediate crisis but whatever came after in this strange new life I'd accidentally stumbled into when I whispered a dead woman's name. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay in the guest bedroom staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of Marchetti's voice through the walls as he made call after call in Italian, too rapid and too quiet for me to decipher completely. Occasionally I'd catch fragments, names I didn't recognize, locations that meant nothing to me, but the tone was consistent throughout, cold, controlled, absolutely certain of the authority he wielded. Around 3 in the morning, the apartment went silent. I waited for the sounds of Marchetti retiring to his own room, but they never came. Instead, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Pause outside my door, then movement toward what I assumed was the kitchen. Curiosity overcame exhaustion. I pulled on the silk robe I'd found hanging in the bathroom and ventured out of the guest room. Marchetti stood at the kitchen island, still dressed in his shirt and trousers from earlier, though he'd removed his tie and rolled up his sleeves. A bottle of expensive whiskey sat on the marble counter beside 2 crystal glasses, and he was staring out the windows at the city lights with an expression of such profound weariness that it made my chest ache. Couldn't sleep either, I said quietly. He turned, unsurprised by my presence. Sleep is a luxury for people who don't have enemies planning their deaths. Would you like a drink? I should probably keep my head clear. Probably. But clear heads don't always help when you're trying to process the impossible. He poured 2 glasses anyway, sliding one across the counter toward me. This is 25-year-old Macallan. If you're going to abandon sobriety, you might as well do it with quality scotch. The whiskey burned going down, but it brought a warmth that eased some of the tension knotting my shoulders. We stood in companionable silence for a moment, 2 people who barely knew each other but somehow understood each other better than most people ever would. Santoro Santoro's agreed to a meeting, Marchetti said finally. Tomorrow afternoon. Neutral territory. He wants to discuss terms for ending this before it escalates into something that brings unwanted attention from law enforcement. That's good, isn't it? Better than more violence. It would be if I trusted his intention. But men like Santoro don't request meetings because they want peace. They request meetings because they want to assess weaknesses, identify vulnerability, determine the best angle of attack when they finally make their move. Then why go? Because refusing would signal fear. And in my world, fear is blood in the water. Sharks circle the moment they sense it. I took another sip of the whiskey, feeling it settle into my stomach like liquid courage. Let me come with you. Marchetti's laugh was short and bitter. Absolutely not. You're a civilian with no training, no experience in this world, no understanding of the danger you'd be walking into. I understand danger perfectly well. I spent tonight watching you shoot someone in a restaurant, then got told I'm now a target for a crime family. My danger education is progressing rapidly. There's a difference between witnessing violence and being present when it happens to you personally. Santoro will have his people there. If the meeting goes badly, if shooting starts, you'd be caught in crossfire. You're not equipped to survive. Or, I said, leaning forward with the kind of intensity that came from desperation and determination in equal measure, I could be your secret weapon. You said yourself that understanding people, reading their intentions, predicting their behavior, that's valuable in your world. Let me prove it. Let me sit in that meeting and tell you what I see in Santoro's body language, micro-expressions, the tells that reveal what he's really planning. Marchetti studied me with that unsettling intensity, conducting assessments I couldn't begin to decode. You're either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish. I haven't determined which yet. Maybe I'm just remarkably tired of being helpless. My mother spent 3 years dying while doctors told us there was nothing more they could do. I watched her fade away piece by piece, unable to stop it or change it or do anything except hold her hand and pretend I wasn't terrified. I'm not doing that again. I'm not sitting passive and helpless while other people determine whether I live or die. Something shifted in his expression. Recognition of shared experience creating connection between us. When Katerina died, I was 3 feet away from her, close enough to see the exact moment life left her eyes, close enough to feel her blood soaking through my shirt, and I couldn't do anything except hold her in rage against how utterly powerless I was to save the person I loved most. So you understand why I need to be there tomorrow. Why sitting in this penthouse waiting for news isn't an option I can accept. He drained his whiskey glass in one long swallow, then refilled it with deliberate precision. If you come, you follow my instructions exactly. No deviation, no independent decision-making, no heroics. Vincent will be armed. So will I. So will at least 3 other men I trust with my life. If I tell you to get down, you get down. If I tell you to run, you run. Understood? Understood. And if Santoro or any of his people try to speak to you directly, you defer to me. Don't answer questions. Don't offer information. Don't try to be helpful or friendly or anything except invisible. You're there to observe, not to engage. I can do invisible. I've been doing it my entire career. Waitressing is different from navigating a mob negotiation. These men eat people like you for breakfast and don't lose sleep over the digestion. Then it's fortunate I'm not planning to be. His smile was sharp as broken glass, but touched with genuine amusement. You know, Katerina would have liked you. She had that same quality of stubborn determination disguised as reasonable cooperation. The comparison created unexpected warmth in my chest. From what you've told me, that sounds like a compliment. It is. She was the strongest person I ever met, just in ways that most people didn't recognize because she expressed her strength through compassion instead of force. We finished our whiskey in silence, the city lights creating patterns across the kitchen floor that shifted every time a cloud passed across the moon. Eventually, Marchetti excused himself to his office to prepare for tomorrow's meeting, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the lingering taste of expensive scotch. Morning came too quickly. I woke to sunlight streaming through the floor to ceiling windows and the smell of coffee brewing somewhere in the apartment. When I emerged from the guest room, I found Vincent had arrived early, sitting at the kitchen counter reviewing what looked like building schematics on a tablet. "Morning, Miss Russo," he said with professional courtesy. "Mr. Marchetti's in his office. Coffee's fresh if you want some." I poured myself a cup, noting the way Vincent tracked my movements with the constant awareness of someone trained to identify threats. "Where's the meeting happening?" "Carlotta's Italian restaurant in Queens. Been neutral territory for 20 years. No family claims it. No one conducts business there except when situations like this require diplomatic solutions. Have you been to many of these meetings? Enough to know they're 50-50 propositions. Half the time everyone walks away satisfied with negotiated terms. The other half someone doesn't walk away at all." The casual way he discussed potential death made my stomach clench. "Which outcome are you expecting today?" Vincent looked up from his tablet, his expression serious. "Honestly, I'm expecting Santoro to try something. He's younger, hungrier than the old guard. He sees Marchetti as a threat to his expansion plans. Taking him out would eliminate significant competition and make a statement about his willingness to challenge established power structures. So this meeting is actually a trap. Most meetings are traps. The question is whether you spring the trap or avoid it entirely. Marchetti emerged from his office around 11, dressed in a different suit than last night, but with the same careful attention to detail. Everything about his appearance communicated power and control, from the precise knot of his tie to the way his jacket hung perfectly across his shoulders, presumably concealing whatever weapons he'd decided to carry today. "You're sure about this?" he asked me, conducting one final assessment before we committed to the plan. "I'm sure." The drive to Queens took 40 minutes through late morning traffic. Vincent drove with the same careful precision he brought to everything, while Marchetti sat in the back seat with me, reviewing details about Santoro and his organization. Dominic Santoro is 38 years old. He inherited his father's territory in the Bronx 5 years ago and has been aggressively expanding ever since. He's smart, educated, Columbia Business School, but he lacks the patient discipline that keeps most crime families stable across generations. He wants everything now, and he's willing to take risks the old guard never would. What kind of risks? Partnering with drug cartels, involving civilians in conflicts that should remain between professionals, attracting law enforcement attention through flashy displays of wealth and violence. His father built an empire on quiet competence. Dominic's turning it into a reality show that will eventually collapse under its own visibility. But in the meantime, he's dangerous. He's extremely dangerous. Desperate ambition makes people unpredictable, and unpredictable enemies are the hardest to defend against. Carlotta's was a modest establishment wedged between a bodega and a dry cleaner, the kind of place that catered to neighborhood regulars rather than tourists seeking authentic Italian experiences. But when we entered through the front door, I immediately understood why this location served as neutral territory. The entire restaurant had been cleared of other customers. 6 men in expensive suits sat at strategic positions around the dining, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Dominic Santoro sat at a corner table, positioned with the same tactical awareness Marchetti preferred. He was younger than I'd expected, his dark hair styled with more attention than seemed practical for a crime boss, his suit slightly too fashionable to be tasteful. Everything about him screamed new money, trying to prove itself worthy of respect it hadn't earned. Dante Santoro said without standing, his use of Marchetti's first name a deliberate insult. "Thank you for coming, and I see you've brought a guest. How unexpected." Marchetti's hand found the small of my back, guiding me toward the table with gentle authority. "Sophia is my associate. She'll be observing our discussion." Observing. Santoro's smile was predatory. "Is that what we're calling waitresses who witness inconvenient incidents these days?" Forced myself to remain expressionless, channeling every lesson my mother had taught me about maintaining dignity in the face of disrespect. But I was already cataloging details about Santoro. The way his eyes constantly assess his men's, the slight tremor in his left hand that suggested either substance use or nervous energy, the particular quality of his smile that never reached his eyes. "Let's dispense with the posturing," Marchetti said, settling into the chair across from Santoro while I took the seat beside him. "You sent men after me last night. They failed. Now you've requested this. I assume you have something productive to propose." "Productive?" Santoro leaned back in his chair with exaggerated casualness. "I'll tell you what would be productive, Dante. You retiring, stepping back from active operations, letting a new generation take over territories you've held for too long." I watched his micro-expressions as he delivered this ultimatum, noting the way his pupils dilated slightly, the increased rate of his breathing, the tension in his jaw muscles. This wasn't confident aggression. This was fear disguised as bravado, and fear made people dangerous in unpredictable ways. Under the table, I found Marchetti's hand and squeezed once. He glanced at me, and I gave the subtlest shake of my head, a warning based purely on instinct and observation. "That's an interesting proposal," Marchetti said, his tone revealing nothing. "But I'm curious what you're offering in exchange for my retirement. Traditionally, negotiations involve mutual concessions rather than unilateral demands. I'm offering to let you walk away from this meeting alive." Seems like a fairly generous concession given the alternative. The threat hung in the air between them, and I felt rather than saw the way Marchetti's men tensed, hands moving fractionally toward concealed weapons. Santoro's people mirrored the movement. We were seconds away from violence that would leave bodies scattered across Carlotta's dining room. "Dominic," I said quietly, surprising myself as much as everyone else in the restaurant. "May I ask you something?" Santoro's attention swung to me, his expression mixing confusion with irritation. "Who the fuck are you to speak during business discussion? I'm someone who reads people very well. And right now I'm reading desperation in you. Elevated stress markers. Involuntary self-soothing behaviors, the physiological signs of someone operating under extreme pressure from sources outside this room." His face flushed with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I think I do. I think someone's pressuring you to eliminate Mr. Marchetti, someone who's promised you support or territory or resources in exchange for removing what they see as an obstacle. But that someone isn't here right now to help you if this meeting goes badly, which means you're making threats you can't back up, hoping intimidation will accomplish what you don't have the actual power to enforce." The silence that followed was absolute. Every man in the restaurant had gone still, processing the implications of what I'd just said. Santoro's expression had shifted from anger to something more complex, a mixture of fury and fear that confirmed my assessment had hit closer to truth than he wanted to admit. Who? Marchetti asked softly, his voice carrying lethal intent. Who's pulling your strings, Dominic? I don't have to answer to you anymore. But you will answer, Marchetti said, his voice dropping to that dangerous register I'd learned meant someone was about to get hurt. Because the alternative is that I assume you're working with someone who poses a threat to my operations, and I respond accordingly. Which means this meeting ends with significantly more bloodshed than either of us planned for. The standoff lasted maybe 10 seconds, though it felt like hours. I watched Santoro's internal struggle play out across his features, watched him calculate odds and assess escape routes, and ultimately recognized that he'd been outmaneuvered by someone he'd dismissed as irrelevant staff. Castellano, he finally said, the name emerging like a confession dragged from unwilling lips. Victor Castellano approached me 6 months ago, said the old alliances were dead, that families who didn't adapt to new realities would be swept aside by those who understood the modern landscape of organized crime. Victor Castellano. I watched Marchetti's reaction carefully, noting the way his jaw tightened fractionally, the only visible sign of emotion he allowed himself. The name clearly carried significance beyond simple business rival. Victor's been trying to rebuild his father's empire since he got out of prison, Marchetti said, speaking as much to me as to Santoro. Thomas Castellano used to control most of Manhattan and significant portions of Brooklyn, but he made the mistake of getting involved in drug trafficking, which brought federal attention his operation couldn't survive. He died in federal custody 10 years ago. His son's been trying to reclaim lost territory ever since. Victor promised me the Lower East Side, Santoro continued, words tumbling out now in a rush of defensive justification. He said if I could eliminate you, he'd provide the muscle and political connections necessary to expand my operations south of Midtown. Said you were the last obstacle preventing a new coalition of families from controlling the entire city. And you believed him. Marchetti's tone carried no judgment, just cold assessment. Believed a man whose father destroyed everything he touched through incompetence and greed. Believed promises from someone who's been systematically failing to rebuild his father's empire for a decade. He had proof, documents, political connections, law enforcement contacts, everything necessary to back up his claims. I leaned forward, studying Santoro's expression with the focused intensity I'd developed through years of reading difficult customers. He's lying, I said quietly. Not about Castellano approaching him, that part's true, but about believing the promises. Look at his eye movements when he discusses the deal. Classic signs of cognitive dissonance. He knew it was too good to be true, but he wanted it to be true badly enough to ignore his instincts. Santoro's face flushed with renewed anger. You don't know anything about me or my decisions. I know desperation when I see it. I know what it looks like when someone's made a choice they regret but can't figure out how to escape. You're not a true believer in Castellano's vision. You're a man who got in over his head and now can't find a way out that doesn't end with either betraying Castellano or betraying Marchetti, both of which probably result in your death. The brutal honesty of my assessment seemed to deflate something in Santoro. His shoulders slumped fractionally, the aggressive posture giving way to something more genuine. You're right, he admitted. I'm fucked either way. If I don't kill Marchetti, Castellano will assume I'm unreliable and eliminate me. If I do kill him, his family will hunt me forever. I thought I was making a smart strategic move. Instead, I painted a target on myself that I can't remove. Marchetti was silent for a long moment, processing this information with the same careful calculation he brought to everything. Around us, the restaurant remained frozen in tense anticipation, everyone waiting for his decision about how this situation would resolve. Here's what's going to happen, he finally said. You're going to tell Victor Castellano that I'm dead, killed in a car accident this afternoon, completely unrelated to any business conflicts. You'll attend my funeral, express appropriate condolences to my family. Position yourself as a grieving ally devastated by the loss. Santoro stared at him in confusion. But you're not dead, not yet. But as far as Victor and anyone in his organization knows, Dante Marchetti died this afternoon, which gives me operational freedom to move against him without him seeing it coming. And what about me? What happens when Castellano eventually figures out the deception? That depends on how useful you make yourself over the next. Help me understand Victor's network, his political connections, his security vulnerabilities. Provide intelligence that helps me dismantle his operation before he can threaten other families. Do that, and I'll ensure you survive what's coming. Refuse, and I'll let Victor discover your role in this conversation, which I suspect will end very badly. The choice was elegant in its simplicity. Cooperate and possibly survive, or refuse and definitely die. Santoro wasn't stupid enough to pretend he had other options. What do you need from me? He asked, his voice carrying the resignation of a man accepting the inevitable. Everything. Names, locations, financial records, anything that gives me leverage over Victor's operations. And you need to start immediately, because the moment Victor realizes I'm still alive, he'll know someone betrayed him, and you're the most obvious candidate. I can get you files. Digital records of every meeting, every promise, every transaction Victor's made over the past 6 months. He's arrogant enough to document everything because he thinks he's building a legitimate business empire instead of a criminal conspiracy. Then get them to Vincent by midnight tonight. Dominic, one more thing. The next time someone approaches you with an offer that sounds too good to be true, remember this moment. Remember that shortcuts in our world almost always lead straight off cliffs. Santoro nodded, standing with the kind of exhausted relief that came from surviving a situation that should have been fatal. His men followed him toward the exit, leaving Carlotta's dining room significantly less tense than it had been 20 minutes earlier. When they were gone, Marchetti turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. That was either brilliant or catastrophically reckless. I haven't determined which yet. It worked, didn't we? We got information about who's actually behind the threat, and we turned a potential enemy into a reluctant asset. We also revealed that you can read people well enough to expose their lies and fears, which makes you valuable, but also makes you a target for anyone who doesn't want their deceptions uncovered. So I was already a target. Now I'm just a more specific kind of target. His smile was sharp as broken glass, but touched with genuine respect. You're adapting to this world faster than most people could. Most civilians would still be processing the trauma of last night. You're already 3 steps ahead, thinking strategically about how to turn problems into advantages. My mother used to say I was born with an old soul, that I understood complexities most people my age couldn't even see. I always thought it was just a nice way of saying I was serious and analytical instead of fun and spontaneous. It's a survival trait in this world. People who can't think several moves ahead don't last long in the kind of environment where every conversation could be your last. Vincent approached our table with the careful deference of someone interrupting an important discussion. We should leave soon, he said. The longer we stay in one location, the more vulnerable we become to surveillance or ambush. Marchetti stood, offering me his hand with old-fashioned courtesy. Ready to continue your education in organized crime? I took his hand, feeling the controlled strength in his grip, the way he steadied me with automatic protectiveness. As ready as I'll ever be. The drive back to Manhattan was quiet. Vincent navigated traffic with his usual precision while Marchetti made calls in Italian too rapid for me to follow completely. I caught fragments about funeral arrangements, about media coverage, about ensuring the fiction of his death would be convincing enough to fool Victor Castellano's intelligence network. We're going to stage an accident, he explained after ending his 4th call. Car explosion in Midtown. Dental records will confirm my death, though obviously they'll be falsified. Closed casket funeral in 3 days. You'll attend as my grieving associate, which gives you a legitimate reason to be seen with my organization while also establishing your cover story. My cover story for what exactly? For working with me permanently. You've proven you have value beyond what I initially recognized. Your ability to read people, to identify deception, to understand psychological patterns that predict behavior, those are skills my organization needs. Skills that could prevent future situations like what we just navigated with Santoro. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a choice. Return to your normal life knowing you'll always be looking over your shoulder, wondering if Victor Castellano or the next ambitious criminal decides you know too much. Or join my organization officially with full protection and compensation appropriate to the value you provide. The offer should have terrified me, should have sent me running back to my studio apartment and my waitressing shifts and my comfortable ignorance about how power actually operated in the shadows of civilized society. But instead, I found myself considering the proposition with surprising seriousness. What would the job actually entail? Behavioral analysis of potential business partners, psychological assessment of people requesting alliances or assistance, security evaluation of new operations to identify vulnerabilities before they're exploited. Essentially, you'd be my personal expert on reading people's true intentions beneath whatever masks they present to the world. And the compensation? Significantly more than you make at Ristorante Lucia, plus housing, security, access to resources most people never encounter. You'd live well, Sophia, better than any legitimate psychology practice could provide, but I'd be working for a crime family, helping facilitate operations that exist outside the law. You'd be preventing violence by identifying threats before they manifest. You'd be protecting people by exposing those who mean them harm. The work might not fit conventional definitions of moral behavior, but its impact would be objectively positive for the people I'm responsible for protecting. The rationalization was smooth, practiced, the kind of logic that probably helped him sleep at night despite the blood on his hand. But there was truth beneath the justification. What I'd done today at Carlotta's had prevented a shootout that would have left multiple people dead. My intervention had turned a violent confrontation into a strategic asset. I need time to think about it, I said finally. You have until the funeral. After that, Victor will be actively hunting for whoever helped fake my death. If you're going to be part of my organization, you'll need full protection before he figures out you exist. The penthouse felt different when we returned, less like a prison and more like a strategic base of operation. Marchetti disappeared into his office again, coordinating the complex logistics of staging his own death. While I retreated to the guest bedroom to process everything that had happened, my phone had 17 missed calls from Carmen and 3 from Giovanni. I called the restaurant first, knowing Giovanni would be practical about the situation. Sophia, his relief was audible through the phone. Thank God. Are you safe? I'm safe. I can't explain everything, but I'm somewhere protected. How's the restaurant? Closed until further notice. Marco's dealing with police interviews and insurance claims. The official story is that rival gang members targeted each other and we were just unfortunate bystanders. No one's mentioning Marchetti by name. Good, that's good. Sophia, whatever you're involved in, whatever choices you're making, just promise me you're thinking clearly. That man's world destroys people. Destroyed his wife. Could destroy you too if you're not careful. I know. But Giovanni, what if I'm already destroyed if I don't accept his protection? What if walking away just means dying slower instead of having a chance to live differently? His sigh carried the weight of experience and worry in equal measure. Then I hope you know what you're doing, and I hope you'll call me if you need help, any kind of help, even if you think I can't provide it. I will, I promise. After we hung up, I stood at the window watching the city lights, thinking about the choice Marchetti had offered. My mother had always said that lives changed in moments, that the path we walked was determined by decisions made when fear and opportunity intersected. This was one of those moments, the kind that would define everything that came. A knock on the door interrupted my contemplation. Come in, I called. Marchetti entered carrying 2 plates of food I hadn't realized had been prepared. You haven't eaten since breakfast. Thought you might be hungry. The domesticity of the gesture was jarring given everything else happening. We ate in companionable silence, and I found myself studying him the way I'd studied so many people throughout my career, trying to understand the man beneath the crime boss persona. The funeral was held at St. Anthony's Cathedral, a towering Gothic structure in Lower Manhattan that had served the Italian community for over a century. I stood near the back of the church wearing a black dress Marchetti's people had provided, watching as hundreds of mourners filed past the closed casket to pay their respects to a man who was very much alive, and watching the proceedings through hidden cameras from a secure location across the city. Vincent stood beside me, his presence both protective and proprietary. To anyone observing, we appeared to be colleagues united in grief. In reality, he was my handler for this operation, feeding me information through a nearly invisible earpiece while monitoring potential threats among the mourners. Third row, left side, gray suit. Vincent's voice was barely audible. That's Marco Terranova, Victor Castellano's second in command. He'll be watching for anything unusual, any sign that Marchetti's death isn't legitimate. I studied the man with practiced subtlety, cataloging details. Mid-40s, expensive but conservative styling, the kind of controlled watchfulness that suggested professional paranoia. He wasn't grieving. He was hunting, scanning the crowd for inconsistencies that would reveal the deception. 2 rows behind Terranova sat Dominic Santoro, his expression appropriately somber, though I could see the tension in his shoulders. The way his hands gripped the pew in front of him with white-knuckled intensity. He was terrified, caught between the fiction he had to maintain and the knowledge that discovery would mean certain death. Santoro's compromised, I whispered, knowing Vincent would relay the information to Marchetti. He's showing too much stress for simple grief. Anyone watching closely will notice he's barely holding himself together. Already noted. We have people positioned to extract him if he breaks. The service was elaborate, conducted in Latin by a priest who probably understood exactly what kind of man he was eulogizing. Speakers took turns sharing carefully curated memories of Dante Marchetti, the businessman, the philanthropist, the pillar of the Italian-American community. No one mentioned the violence, the criminal enterprises, the bodies that had accumulated over his career. In death as in life, he was 2 people simultaneously, the public face and the hidden truth. I found myself studying the mourners with the kind of analytical attention that had become second nature. There were the legitimate associates, restaurant managers and business partners who probably suspected but carefully avoided knowing too much. There were family members, distant cousins and aging aunts who remembered Dante as a child before he became the man who commanded fear and respect in equal measure. And there were the criminals, easily identified by their watchful positioning in expensive suits, evaluating each other with the constant vigilance of predators in a temporary truce. Front row, center, Vincent said. That's Dante's mother, Sophia Marchetti, 83 years old. She knows the truth about today, but she's playing her role perfectly. The elderly woman sat with rigid dignity, her weathered face composed despite what must have been the terror of participating in this elaborate fiction. I watched her accept condolences from people who'd known her son for decades, watched her maintain the performance with the skill of someone who'd spent a lifetime hiding difficult truths behind socially acceptable facades. After the service, the procession moved to the cemetery where the empty casket would be buried with full honors. I rode in one of the black limousines surrounded by people I didn't know, listening to conversations conducted in Italian about business matters disguised as personal reminiscences. At the graveside, I positioned myself where I could observe the attendees without drawing attention. This was the critical moment when Victor Castellano would either accept the fiction of Marchetti's death or reveal suspicion that could unravel everything. He arrived late, a calculated power play that ensured everyone noticed his entrance. Victor Castellano was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of expensive grooming and obsessive attention to presentation, but it was his eyes that told the real story, cold and calculating, conducting assessments that missed nothing. He approached Sophia Marchetti with practiced condolences, speaking in Italian too quiet for me to hear, but I watched their interaction carefully, noting the way she responded with genuine emotion that couldn't be entirely fabricated. Whatever she said to him, it carried the weight of authentic grief, and I saw something in Victor's expression shift fractionally. Not quite acceptance, but the beginning of belief. Target acquired, I whispered to Vincent. Victor's buying it, but not completely. He's still testing, still looking for cracks in the story. Keep watching. Let me know if anything changes. The burial was mercifully brief. As mourners began dispersing, Victor made his rounds through the crowd, speaking to key people, gathering intelligence disguised as shared grief. I stayed near the edges, observing without engaging, until his path inevitably brought him to where I stood. I don't believe we've met, he said, extending his hand with practiced charm. Victor Castellano. I was a friend of Dante's, Sophia Russo. I worked with him occasionally. My handshake was brief, professional, revealing nothing. Worked with him how? His interest seemed casual, but I caught the calculation beneath the courtesy. Consulting, hospitality industry analysis, boring business stuff that probably isn't appropriate conversation for a funeral. No, of course not. His smile didn't reach his eyes. It's just that I thought I knew all of Dante's associates, and I don't recall hearing your name. I kept a low profile. Preferred it that way. Smart policy in his line of work. Though I suppose that line of work ended yesterday afternoon when his car exploded. Tragic accident. Very unexpected. The way he emphasized accidents sent warning signals through my nervous system. He was testing, probing for reaction, trying to determine if I knew more than I should. I channeled every lesson my mother had taught me about maintaining composure under scrutiny. Life is fragile, I said quietly. We never know when our time will come. Makes you appreciate the moments we have. Indeed. Well, Miss Russo, if you ever find yourself in need of new consulting opportunities, I'd be happy to discuss potential arrangements. I'm always looking for talented people who understand the hospitality industry. The offer was a trap, an attempt to pull me into his orbit where he could monitor me more closely. I appreciate that, but I'm planning to take some time away from the industry. This situation has been difficult to process, of course. But here's my card anyway, in case you change your mind. I accepted the business card with appropriate gratitude, knowing it would be analyzed for prints and any embedded tracking devices before I touched it again. Victor moved on to his next target, leaving me with the uncomfortable certainty that I'd attracted exactly the kind of attention we'd been trying to avoid. Vincent materialized at my elbow as the crowd began thinning. We need to leave, now. What's wrong? Victor's people are photographing mourners, running facial recognition. If they identify you as the waitress from Ristorante Lucia, they'll know something's wrong. We moved toward the parking area with calculated casualness, not rushing but not lingering. Behind us, I could feel eyes tracking our movement, assessing whether our departure warranted closer attention. The walk to Vincent's car felt endless, every step measured against the possibility of someone calling out, someone stopping us, someone recognizing me from that night at the restaurant. We were 3 blocks away when my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Interesting performance today. We should talk soon. V. He knows, I said, showing the message to Vincent. Not necessarily. Could just be standard intimidation, keeping you off balance, making sure you understand he's watching. Or he's figured out the deception, and he's letting us know he's coming. Vincent's jaw tightened. Either way, we need to get you back to the penthouse. Full lockdown protocols until we know what we're dealing with. The security at the penthouse had been increased dramatically. 2 additional men stationed in the hallway, cameras monitoring every approach, and electronic countermeasures that would detect any surveillance equipment within 100 yards. I was no longer a guest. I was an asset requiring protection. Marchetti emerged from his office when we arrived, his expression darkening as he read Victor's message. He's moving faster than I anticipated. I thought we'd have at least a week before he started testing the fiction. Maybe he never believed it, I suggested. Maybe he's been suspicious from the start and just played along to see how we'd react. Then he's more intelligent than his father, which makes him significantly more dangerous. Marchetti paced the length of the living room, conducting calculations I could only partially follow. We need to accelerate our timeline. Hit his operations before he can organize a coordinated response. What operations specifically? He has 3 primary revenue streams: drug distribution through legitimate pharmaceutical networks, gambling operations disguised as online gaming companies, and protection rackets targeting immigrant-owned businesses in Queens and the Bronx. Take out his revenue, and his ability to fund expansion collapses. And how do we take out his revenue? We expose him to the authorities he's been paying off, create situations where protecting him becomes more costly than prosecuting him, turn his political connections into liabilities instead of assets. That sounds complicated. It is. This is why I need your help. Your ability to read people, to understand their motivations, to predict how they'll respond to pressure. That's what makes this possible. He spread files across the dining room table, thick folders containing surveillance photos and financial records and detailed analyses of Victor's organization. For the next 3 hours, we studied his empire piece by piece, identifying vulnerabilities and pressure points that could be exploited. This man here, I said, pointing to a photo of a well-dressed politician shaking hands with Victor at a charity function. Manhattan District Councilman Robert Morrison. He's been on Victor's payroll for 6 years, voting against business regulations that would impact gambling operations. But look at his body language in these photos. The forced smile, the way he positions himself to maintain distance even while appearing friendly. He's not a true believer. He's someone who got in over his head and now can't find a way out, similar to Santoro. Exactly like Santoro, which means he's vulnerable to the same strategy. Offer him protection in exchange for cooperation. Give him a path to escape that doesn't end with prosecution or assassination. Marchetti studied the photos with renewed interest. Morrison has access to sealed indictments and grand jury proceedings. If he's willing to share information, we could anticipate Victor's legal troubles before they become public. Use that intelligence to pressure other people in Victor's network. We continued like this, dissecting Victor's organization person by person, finding the cracks that could be widened into fracture. I'd never felt more alive, more useful, more like my particular combination of skills finally had purpose beyond managing difficult customers and maximizing tips. Around midnight, we took a break. Marchetti ordered food from a restaurant his family owned, and we ate at the dining room table surrounded by files and photographs that documented the systematic dismantling of Victor Castellano's criminal empire. "You're good at this," he said, pouring wine into glasses that probably cost more than my monthly rent used to be. Natural talent for strategic analysis. Most people with psychology backgrounds focus on therapy and rehabilitation. You focus on understanding power dynamics and predicting behavior in high-stress situations. My mother used to say I saw the world like a chess game, always thinking several moves ahead, always considering what people would do rather than what they said they'd do. Katerina thought like that too. Not about crime or violence, but about her students. She could predict which kids would struggle, which ones would excel, which ones needed intervention before they fell through the cracks. She saved more lives through that intuition than I ever have through all my careful planning. You still miss her every day, but especially in moments like this when I'm doing work she would have hated, making decisions she would have questioned, becoming more of the person she feared I already was. Do you think she'd be disappointed in you? He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his wine glass with expression of such profound sadness it made my chest ache. I think she'd be disappointed that I never found a way to leave this life, that I let her death trap me in a cycle of violence and revenge instead of using it as motivation to become someone different, someone better. It's not too late. You could still choose differently. His smile was bitter. Men like me don't get to retire, Sophia. We either die in conflicts like the one we're currently navigating, or we die old and alone, abandoned by everyone who ever cared about us because they finally understood what monsters we'd become. I don't think you're a monster. Then you haven't been paying close enough attention. I've been paying very close attention, and what I see is someone who protects the people he cares about, who operates by consistent principles even when those principles exist outside normal morality, who carries grief like a physical weight because he's capable of genuine love. Monsters don't mourn their wives for 7 years. Monsters don't offer protection to waitresses who stumbled into dangerous situations. Monsters don't spend hours planning strategies that minimize casualties. He reached across the table, his hand finding mine with unexpected gentleness. You see what you want to see because seeing the truth would require accepting that you're falling for someone who's objectively terrible. Maybe I'm seeing the truth and you're the one believing fiction. The fiction that you're worse than you actually are, because that's easier than accepting you might deserve happiness. The moment hung between us, weighted with implications neither of us was quite ready to acknowledge. His thumb traced small circles on the back of my hand, a gesture so intimate and unconscious it revealed more than any words could. Then his phone buzzed, shattering the fragile connection we'd been building. "Santoro's files just arrived," he said, releasing my hand with obvious reluctance. "Vincent's bringing them up now. We should review them immediately while the information is still current." The files were extensive, hundreds of pages documenting every interaction Santoro had witnessed between Victor and his network of corrupt officials, law enforcement contacts, and business partners. Reading through them felt like watching a criminal empire's organizational chart come into focus, each document revealing another layer of influence and corruption. "This is more than we expected," I said, studying photographs of Victor meeting with a federal prosecutor in what appeared to be a private club. "If even half of these connections are legitimate, he's got protection at every level of government." "Had protection?" Marchetti corrected, past tense, because most of these people aren't loyal to Victor personally. They're loyal to whoever's paying them the most or threatening them most effectively. Show them Victor's vulnerable, show them we have evidence of their corruption, and they'll turn on him faster than he can organize a defense. How do we show them he's vulnerable? We exposed his pharmaceutical operation. It's his largest revenue stream and the one most dependent on political protection. Shut that down publicly. Make it a media story that his corrupt officials can't sweep under the rug. And suddenly everyone in his network starts calculating whether staying loyal is worth the risk of prosecution. I studied the files detailing Victor's drug distribution network, noting the careful documentation of shipments and financial transactions. He's been meticulous about record keeping, almost obsessively so. That's unusual for someone in this business, isn't it? Very unusual. Most criminals understand that documentation creates evidence. The fact that Victor's been keeping detailed records suggests either arrogance or preparation for something bigger. Like what? Like eventually going legitimate. These records could be sanitized, presented as evidence of a business operation that was unknowingly infiltrated by criminal elements. Victor cooperates with prosecutors, provides testimony against his subordinates, walks away with immunity while everyone else goes to prison. He'd betray his own people to save himself. Men like Victor don't have people, they have assets. and assets get liquidated when they no longer serve their purpose. The cynicism in his voice carried the weight of experience. I wondered how many times Marchetti had witnessed betrayal, how many relationships he'd seen destroyed by the particular moral vacancy required to survive in this world. And I wondered if he saw that same capacity for betrayal in himself, if that's what kept him isolated despite his power and wealth. We need someone inside law enforcement who isn't on Victor's payroll, I said, redirecting focus to the strategic problem. Someone who'd be willing to receive anonymous tips about pharmaceutical fraud, who has the jurisdiction and motivation to investigate without being blocked by corrupt supervisors. Marchetti pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts with practiced efficiency. I know someone, federal prosecutor, Eastern District. She's ambitious, clean, and has been looking for a career-making case since she transferred from Boston 2 years ago. Victor's operation would be exactly what she needs. Can you trust her? I don't trust anyone completely, but I trust her ambition. She wants to make a name for herself prosecuting high-level corruption. Give her the evidence and the political cover to move forward, and she'll pursue it with the kind of zealous determination that Victor's paid officials can't contain. He made the call, speaking in careful euphemisms that would mean nothing to anyone monitoring the line, but conveyed everything necessary to someone who understood the context. When he finished, his expression carried something that might have been satisfaction or might have been grim determination. She's interested. Wants to meet tomorrow to review evidence. If what we have is as substantial as I suggested, she convene a grand jury within the week. And then what happens? Then Victor's entire network collapses. His political protection evaporates. His revenue streams dry up. His organization fractures as everyone starts looking for immunity deals. Within a month, he'll be either in federal custody or dead, killed by someone in his own organization trying to cut a better deal with prosecutors. It seems too easy to clean. It's not easy or clean. It's just necessary. And it's possible because you identified the vulnerabilities that made this strategy viable. Your analysis of his people, your understanding of their psychological weak points, that's what transforms general strategy into actionable tactic. The praise created unexpected warmth in my chest. I'd spent years feeling like my particular combination of skills didn't quite fit in. Too analytical for conventional psychology, too focused on reading people to thrive in academic research. But here, in this world of calculated violence and strategic deception, I'd found a place where my abilities had concrete value. We worked through the night, preparing files for the prosecutor, organizing evidence in ways that would be compelling to a grand jury, identifying which of Victor's people would be most vulnerable to pressure when the indictments started dropping. By dawn, we had a comprehensive strategy that would systematically dismantle everything Victor had built. You should get some sleep, Marchetti said as the first light began filtering through the penthouse windows. We have the meeting with the prosecutor at 10 and you need to be sharp for it. Will she ask questions about how we obtained this information? Undoubtedly, but we'll have answers prepared. Anonymous sources, concerned citizens, confidential informants. The standard fictions that allow prosecutors to use intelligence they know came from questionable sources, but can't officially acknowledge. I should have been exhausted, but adrenaline and caffeine had pushed me past normal fatigue into a kind of hyper-alertness, where everything seems simultaneously too sharp and slightly unreal. You're not going to sleep either, are you? Can't. Too much to coordinate before the meeting. Besides, I've gotten by on minimal sleep for years. It's an occupational hazard of constantly expecting assassination attempts. That sounds like a terrible way to live. It is, but it's the only way I know anymore. I stood, intending to retreat to the guest bedroom, but found myself pausing beside his chair. His hand caught mine, holding it with gentle pressure that conveyed both comfort and desire. For a moment, we existed in perfect stillness, two people balanced on the edge of something that would change everything between us. "Sophia," he said quietly, "I need you to understand something before this goes any further. My world destroys beautiful things. It destroyed Katerina. It's destroyed everyone I've ever cared about. If you stay, if you choose to be part of this permanently, I can't promise to keep you safe. Can't guarantee that what happened to her won't eventually happen to you. I know. Do you? Do you really understand that this choice isn't romantic or exciting or any of the other things people imagine when they think about organized crime? It's watching your back constantly. It's never fully trusting anyone. It's accepting that any moment could be your last and making peace with that reality. My mother died slowly, painfully, expensively. I watched her fight for every breath while medical bills bankrupted us and doctors offered sympathies instead of solutions. At least in your world, if I die, it'll be quick. At least I'll have lived on my own terms instead of slowly suffocating under the weight of circumstances I couldn't control. That's not reassurance. That's rationalization. Maybe, but it's my rationalization to make." I pulled him to his feet, closing the distance between us until I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "You don't get to make my choices for me, Dante. You don't get to decide what risks I'm willing to take or what kind of life I want to live. That's not protection. That's control disguised as concern." Something shifted in his expression, vulnerability breaking through the careful control he maintained. "You're right. I'm sorry. I just don't want to be responsible for destroying someone else I care about. Then don't destroy me. Protect me. Work with me. Trust that I'm strong enough to survive in your world because I've already survived things that would have broken weaker." His hands found my face with exquisite exquisite gentleness, thumbs tracing my cheekbones as if memorizing the architecture of my features. Katerina was strong too, stronger than anyone gave her credit for, and she still died because I wasn't careful enough, wasn't vigilant enough, didn't anticipate the threat until it was too late. You can't live every day trying to prevent what happened to her from happening again. That's not living. That's existing in a permanent state of traumatic reenactment. How do you know these things? How do you read people so accurately that it feels like you're seeing straight through every defense I've constructed? Because I do the same thing. I've spent my entire life reading rooms and assessing threats and understanding what people want before they articulate it themselves. We're the same, you just shaped by different circumstances into different expressions of the same fundamental skill. When he kissed me, it felt like inevitability finally manifested. Not rushed or desperate, but deliberate and thorough, acclaiming that acknowledged everything we'd been building towards since that first night at Ristorante Lucia. His hands tangled in my hair, pulling me closer as 7 years of grief and isolation cracked beneath the force of genuine connection. We made our way to his bedroom in a series of breathless moments, shedding clothes and inhibitions in equal measure. The vulnerable man I'd glimpsed beneath the crime boss persona emerged fully, showing me sides of himself he'd probably kept hidden since Katerina's death. There was urgency, but also tenderness, desire tempered by the careful attention of someone who understood this moment mattered beyond physical gratification. Afterward, we lay tangled in expensive sheets, his fingers tracing patterns across my bare shoulder while dawn light painted the room in shades of gold and amber. Outside the windows, New York was waking up. Millions of people starting their days with no idea that above them, in this penthouse fortress, two people who should never have met were rewriting the boundaries of what was possible between them. I should regret this, he said quietly. Should maintain professional distance. Should remember all the reasons getting emotionally involved with people in my organization leads to disaster. But you don't regret it, no. Which probably means I'm making another catastrophic error in judgment. But for the first time in 7 years, I feel something other than rage and grief. That has to count for something. It counts for everything. I shifted to look at him directly, taking in the softened edges of his expression, the way vulnerability transformed him into someone younger and less burdened. We don't get many chances to feel alive, to connect with someone who understands us completely. Wasting those chances because we're afraid of potential consequences seems like the real error. You make it sound simple. It is simple. Everything else, the violence and strategy and careful calculations, that's complicated. What's happening between us, is the only simple thing in either of our lives. His smile was genuine for once, untouched by cynicism or calculation. If we survive the next few weeks, remind me that you said that. Remind me that something can be simple instead of tactical. When we survive the next few weeks, I'll remind you every day. The meeting with the federal prosecutor was scheduled for 10, which gave us exactly 3 hours to prepare. We dressed in careful silence, the intimacy of the night transforming into professional focus as we transitioned back into our roles. But something fundamental had shifted between us, a recognition that whatever happened next, we'd face it together rather than as separate individuals navigating the same crisis. Vincent arrived at 9:30 with updated intelligence about Victor's movements. He's consolidating resources, moving money offshore, calling in favors. He knows something's coming, just not what or when. Good, Marchetti said, reviewing the files one final time. Paranoia makes people reactive instead of strategic. He'll make mistakes we can exploit. The prosecutor's office was in Lower Manhattan, a sterile government building that felt worlds away from the elegant penthouse we'd left. We were shown into a conference room where Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh waited, surrounded by case files and legal documents that suggested she'd been preparing for this meeting as thoroughly as we had. Jennifer Walsh was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with the kind of sharp intelligence that manifested in how she conducted her initial assessment of us. Her eyes moved between Marchetti and me with practiced evaluation, cataloging details most people would miss, determining how much of what we were about to tell her she could believe. "Thank you for meeting with us," Marchetti said, settling into the chair across from her with easy confidence. "I understand you have questions about the source of the information we're providing." "I have questions about everything," Walsh replied, her voice carrying the particular edge of someone who'd prosecuted enough criminals to recognize when they were sitting across from her. "Let's start with the obvious one. Who are you really, Mr. Marchetti? Because the man who died in a car explosion 3 days ago doesn't typically schedule meetings with federal prosecutors." The directness of her question created momentary tension. Marchetti's expression didn't change, but I felt him recalibrating, adjusting his approach to match her unwillingness to engage in comfortable fictions. "I'm someone with extensive knowledge of Victor Castellano's criminal operations, someone who's been documenting his activities for years, waiting for the right opportunity to ensure his prosecution would actually succeed instead of being blocked by corrupt officials on his payroll. And you're providing this information out of civic duty?" Walsh's skepticism was palpable. "Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe. I'm providing it because Victor's expansion threatens my legitimate business interests, and because I have reason to believe he's targeting me for elimination. Call it enlightened self-interest rather than altruism." Walsh turned her attention to me, conducting the same thorough assessment. "And you are?" "Sophia Russo. I'm a psychological consultant. I've been been helping analyze Victor's organization, identifying vulnerabilities and predicting behavioral patterns that could be useful for prosecution strategy. Psychological consultant. Walsh's tone suggested she found the euphemism amusing. And what exactly does a psychological consultant do for someone in M.R. Marchetti's line of work? I read people, determine who can be trusted, who's vulnerable to pressure, who's likely to cooperate with authorities when faced with prosecution. In Victor's case, I've identified at least 8 members of his organization who would almost certainly accept immunity deals in exchange for testimony. Walsh pulled out a legal pad, her professional interest overriding her skepticism. I'm listening. For the next hour, we walked her through Victor's pharmaceutical operation in exhaustive detail. Santoro's files provided the foundation, but I added psychological analysis of each key player, explaining why they'd be motivated to cooperate and what specific pressures would be most effective in securing their testimony. This man here, I said, pointing to a photograph of Victor's distribution manager, Marcus Chun. He's been embezzling from the operation for 2 years. Small amounts, carefully hidden, but Victor suspects something's wrong. Chun knows if Victor discovers the truth, he's dead. Offer him immunity and protection, show him evidence that Victor's already investigating him, and he'll provide every detail of the distribution network in exchange for safety. How do you know he's embezzling? Body language and surveillance photos. The way he positions himself in meetings, always maintaining distance from Victor, always calculating exit routes, classic signs of someone operating under extreme stress from hidden guilt. Plus, there are discrepancies in the financial records Santoro provided, small inconsistencies that suggest someone skimming profits. Walsh studied the photographs with renewed interest, making notes on her legal pad. If what you're telling me is accurate, this could be the largest pharmaceutical fraud case in the district's history. We're talking about millions of dollars in illegal opioid distribution, dozens of corrupt officials, and a criminal network that extends into multiple states. Which is why you need to move quickly, Marchetti said. Victor knows something's wrong. He's consolidating resources, preparing for either prosecution or war. Give him time to organize a defense, and half these people will disappear or end up dead before you can flip them. I'll need to brief my superiors, convene a grand jury, coordinate with DE and FBI. That's weeks of preparation at minimum. You don't have weeks. Victor's already suspicious about my death. If he figures out I'm alive, he'll know someone betrayed him. Santoro will be killed within hours. Everyone else in his organization will go to ground. Your window for effective prosecution will close permanently. Then what do you suggest? We move simultaneously. You get arrest warrants for the lowest level players first, the ones most likely to cooperate immediately. Use their testimony to secure warrants for higher level targets. Work your way up the organization while Victor's still trying to figure out what's happened. That's not how federal prosecutions typically work, M.R. Marchetti. Then adapt your typical approach, because if you wait for normal procedure, you'll end up with a case full of dead witnesses and destroyed evidence. Walsh was silent for a long moment, conducting calculations I could only partially follow. She was ambitious, Marchetti had said, looking for a career-making case. The question was whether her ambition would overcome her instinct to follow standard procedures. I'll need immunity agreements for both of you, she finally said. Full cooperation, complete testimony, protection for the duration of the prosecution. In exchange, any potential charges related to your activities remain sealed, unless you're found to be withholding material information. I don't need immunity because I haven't committed any crimes, I said. I'm providing analysis based on observation and documentation. Nothing illegal about that. Walsh's expression suggested she found my innocence claim somewhere between amusing and insulting. Miss Russo, the moment you accepted employment from M.R. Marchetti, you became part of a criminal conspiracy. Whether you personally committed specific crimes is irrelevant. You're an accessory to everything his organization has done since you joined. The words hit like physical blows. In the space of a few days, I'd gone from waitress to criminal accessory, implicated in crimes I hadn't witnessed and activities I barely understood. The career I'd been building, the legitimate life I'd imagined for myself, had evaporated the moment I'd whispered Katerina's name. I'll take the immunity agreement, Marchetti said before I could respond. Miss Russo is under my protection. Any agreements you make with me extend to her as well. That's not how immunity works. It is if you want the evidence I'm providing. Otherwise, we walk out of here and you can spend the next 5 years trying to build a case from scratch while Victor continues operating with complete impunity. The negotiation continued for another hour. Lawyers and criminals engaging in the eternal dance of strategic compromise. Eventually, Walsh agreed to immunity provisions that would protect both Marchetti and me in exchange for complete cooperation with her prosecution strategy. Documents were signed with the kind of casual efficiency that belied how fundamentally they changed our legal positions. As we left the federal building, Vincent was waiting with the car and news that couldn't have been worse. Santoro's missing. No one's seen him since the funeral yesterday. His apartment's been cleared out, his phone's disconnected, and his people are saying he left town for personal reasons. Marchetti's expression darkened. Victor found out. He knows someone gave us the files. How could he know? We've been careful, not careful enough. Vincent's jaw tightened. There was a tracking device embedded in the file folders, sophisticated enough that our sweeps didn't catch it. Victor's been monitoring exactly where those files went and who handled them. The implications crystallized with terrifying clarity. Victor knew Marchetti had Santoro's files, which meant he knew Marchetti was alive, which meant the elaborate fiction of the funeral had collapsed, and now we were exposed without the element of surprise that had been our primary advantage. How long has he known? Marchetti asked. Since last night. The tracker was activated when we brought the files to the penthouse. He's had 12 hours to plan a response. 12 hours was an eternity in Victor's world. Time enough to reposition resources, eliminate loose ends, and organize the kind of coordinated strike that would remove all his enemies simultaneously. We'd been so focused on the federal prosecution strategy that we'd missed the immediate tactical threat. We need to move locations immediately, Vincent continued. The penthouse isn't secure anymore. We have to assume Victor knows exactly where you are and has people in position to strike. Where can we go that he doesn't already know about? The warehouse district in Brooklyn, property we acquired 2 months ago. It's not in any of the public records Victor would have access to. Not comfortable, but defensible. Marchetti pulled out his phone, typing rapid messages to people I didn't know. His entire demeanor had shifted from the vulnerable intimacy of this morning to the cold calculation of someone preparing for war. Make the arrangements. Full security team. Ammunition, medical supplies, communications equipment. If Victor's coming, I want to be ready. What about the prosecutor? I asked. Walsh said she needed weeks to organize arrests. If Victor's moving now, we don't have weeks. Then we force Walsh to accelerate her timeline. Give her enough evidence that her superiors have no choice but to authorize immediate action. Make this a media story that can't be contained by corrupt officials. How do we do that? We give an exclusive interview to someone who can't be intimidated or bought. Someone whose reporting will force federal action before Victor can complete his consolidation. You mean go public? I mean we stop playing defense and start attacking. Victor thinks he's controlling this situation. Time to show him he's already lost. The drive to Brooklyn was tense. Vincent took circuitous routes through neighborhoods I didn't recognize, constantly checking mirrors for surveillance or pursuit. In the backseat, Marchetti made call after call, his Italian too rapid for me to follow completely, but the urgency was unmistakable. The warehouse was exactly as advertised. Not comfortable. The space had been converted into a basic safe house with sleeping quarters that were more military barracks than bedrooms, a communications center that looked like something from a spy thriller, and enough weapons to outfit a small army. This is where we make our stand, Marchetti said, surveying the space with tactical assessment. Victor will find us eventually. He's too thorough not to. But by the time he does, we'll have exposed him so completely that coming after us will be the final mistake that destroys everything he's built. I watched him transform before my eyes, from the man who'd held me this morning with tender vulnerability to the crime boss who commanded absolute loyalty through calculated menace. Both versions were real. I understood. Both existed simultaneously within the same person, emerging as circumstances required. What do you need me to do? I asked. Help me understand Victor's psychology. He knows I'm alive now, knows I have his files, knows I've been working with federal prosecutors. What does he do next? How does he respond to having all his careful plans disrupted? I closed my eyes, visualizing Victor at the funeral, remembering the cold calculation in his expression, the way he'd assessed everyone with predatory efficiency. He's not going to panic. He's too controlled for that. Instead, he'll double down, accelerate his original timeline. If he was planning to eliminate you and take over your territory, he'll do it now, before the federal prosecution gains momentum. He'll see this as his last opportunity to accomplish his goals before everything collapses. So he'll come after me personally. He'll come after everything you care about. Your family, your business operations, anyone who could testify against him. He'll try to create so much chaos that federal prosecutors can't build a coherent case through the wreckage. Marchetti was silent for a moment, processing the implication. Then we need to get everyone I care about to safety before he can reach them. My mother, my cousins, key people in my organization who might be vulnerable. And me? Am I vulnerable? His expression softened fractionally, the crime boss mask slipping to reveal genuine concern. You're the most vulnerable because you're the one person whose loss would actually destroy me. Victor understands that. He saw us together at the funeral, saw how I positioned myself to protect you. He'll use you against me if he gets the chance. Then don't let him get the chance. Keep me close. Keep me useful. Don't sideline me because you're afraid of what might happen. The tension was broken by Vincent's voice from the communications center. We've got moved. 3 vehicles approaching from different directions. Professional spacing, tactical positioning. This isn't surveillance. This is assault preparation. Marchetti's weapon appeared in his hand with practiced speed. How long until they're in position? 5 minutes, maybe less. Then we need to be ready. He turned to me, his expression carrying urgency and something that might have been regret. Stay in the back room, lock the door. Don't come out until someone you trust tells you it's safe. I'm not hiding while you fight. This isn't negotiable, Sophia. I need to focus on keeping everyone alive. Can't do that if I'm worried about you being caught in crossfire. The logic was sound even if I hated it. I retreated to the back room as instructed, listening to Marchetti coordinate coordinate defensive positions with military precision. Through the walls, I could hear his voice calm and controlled, directing his people with the absolute confidence of someone who'd survived dozens of similar situations. Then the first shots shattered the windows. The gunfire was deafening, even through the reinforced walls. I crouched in the back room, hands pressed over my ears, trying to control the panic threatening to overwhelm my rational thinking. This was real violence, not the sanitized version I'd studied in criminology courses or witnessed at a distance. This was the brutal reality of Marchetti's world manifesting, in automatic weapons and the screams of men fighting for their lives. Through the door, I could hear Vincent shouting, "Coordinates!" Marchetti's calm voice directing defensive fire, and the unmistakable sounds of people being hit. The walls weren't bulletproof, I realized with growing horror. Rounds were punching through the warehouse's exterior, ricocheting off metal support beams, creating a deadly crossfire that made every square foot of the building potentially lethal. I needed to do something. Hiding accomplished nothing except ensuring that if everyone else died, I'd be trapped in this room with no escape route and no way to defend myself. My mother's voice echoed in my memory, something she'd said during her final weeks when the cancer had stolen everything except her essential nature. Never be helpless, Sophia. Never let circumstances make you passive when action might save you. The door wasn't locked from the outside. I'd chosen not to secure it, maintaining the option of exit if the situation deteriorated beyond defense. Now I eased it open, peering into the main warehouse space to assess the tactical situation with the same analytical attention I'd brought to reading people. Marchetti's team had taken defensive positions behind reinforced barriers, creating interlocking fields of fire that made direct assault costly for Victor's forces. But they were outnumbered, maybe 2 to 1 based on the volume of incoming fire, and ammunition wouldn't last forever. The assault was designed to overwhelm through attrition, to force Marchetti's people to exhaust their resources while Victor's reinforcements could rotate in fresh shooters. Vincent saw me emerge from the back room, his expression flashing from surprise to anger. "Get back inside," he shouted over the gunfire. I ignored him, moving instead to the communications center where surveillance monitors showed Victor's tactical positioning. 3 vehicles, just as Vincent had reported, positioned to create a kill box around the warehouse. But something about their arrangement seemed wrong. Inefficient for the kind of coordinated assault a professional would organize. "They're not trying to kill us," I shouted to Marchetti across the warehouse floor. "Look at their positioning. They're set up to contain, not to overwhelm. This is a holding action, not a final assault." Marchetti processed this information while returning fire through a shattered window. "What are they holding us for?" "For Victor to arrive personally. He needs to be present for your death. Needs to make it personal instead of delegated. It's not enough for him to win. He needs to prove he won. How long until he gets here?" I studied the surveillance feeds, noting vehicle movements in the surrounding blocks. Based on traffic patterns and likely routes from his known locations, maybe 15 minutes. Maybe less if he was already close when the assault began. Then we have 15 minutes to change the tactical situation before this becomes unwinnable. Marchetti pulled out his phone, typing rapidly while still maintaining his defensive position. "Walsh is sending federal agents. They were already mobilized for arrests when I contacted her. Should be here within 20 minutes. So we just need to survive 5 more minutes than Victor expects us to." "Exactly. Which means we make him think we're weaker than we are. Make him confident enough to enter the kill zone." The next 10 minutes were among the longest of my life. Marchetti ordered his people to reduce their rate of fire, to act as though ammunition was running low and defensive positions were collapsing. Victor's forces responded by increasing their pressure, moving closer to the warehouse in preparation for final assault. I watched the surveillance monitors with hyper-focused attention, tracking vehicle movements, identifying patterns that suggested command and control. When a black SUV appeared 2 blocks away, moving with the kind of careful precision that distinguished principals from support personnel, I knew we'd found our target. "Victor's here," I announced. Black SUV, approaching from the northeast. 2 escort vehicles providing security. Marchetti moved to join me at the monitors, his presence solid and reassuring despite the chaos surrounding us. "We need to draw him inside. Make him think he's walking into a victory instead of a trap." "How?" "You're gonna surrender." The words hit like physical blows. I stared at him, trying to determine if he was serious or if the stress of combat had temporarily fractured his judgment. "You want me to what?" "Victor saw us together at the funeral, saw how I protected you. If you walk out that door with your hands up, appearing to surrender, he'll come inside to claim his prize. And when he does, we'll have him exactly where we want him. And if he just shoots me immediately, he won't. Not until he's extracted every bit of intelligence about my operation, about federal prosecution strategy, about everyone who's cooperated with authorities. You're too valuable to kill quickly." That's not particularly reassuring. His hands found my face with the same gentleness he'd shown this morning, a lifetime ago when intimacy had seemed possible instead of suicidal. "I won't let him hurt you. I've lost everyone I ever cared about to this world. I'm not losing you too. Then you better be as good at rescue as you are at strategy. The best." I walked toward the warehouse's main entrance, hands raised, trying to project the combination of fear and defeat that would sell the surrender. Behind me, Marchetti's people maintained sporadic fire, just enough to suggest desperation rather than tactical deception. The gunfire from Victor's forces slowed, then stopped entirely as they recognized what was happening. The door was heavy, Industrial steel designed to withstand forced entry. I pushed it open slowly, squinting against the afternoon sunlight that seemed impossibly bright after the warehouse's dim interior. Outside, a dozen men in tactical gear had positioned themselves with weapons trained on the entrance, and behind them, emerging from the black SUV with predatory confidence, was Victor Castellano. "Miss Russo," he called out, his voice carrying false warmth. "How unexpected to see you here." I'd assumed Marchetti would have more sense than to bring a civilian into a combat. I didn't have much choice. My voice trembled convincingly, selling the fear that wasn't entirely manufactured. "He said I'd be safe here. And yet here you are, hands raised, walking into the arms of the very people he was trying to protect you from." Seems like his judgment was flawed. Victor approached with careful confidence, staying behind his security personnel, maintaining tactical distance even while projecting casual control. Up close, I could see the calculations running behind his eyes, assessing whether my surrender was genuine or trap. "Where is he?" Victor asked. "Where's Dante?" "Inside, wounded, I think. He told me to run to save myself, so there was no point in both of us dying for his mistakes." His mistakes. Victor's smile was sharp as broken glass. Is that what he called them? I'd characterize them differently. Arrogance, territorial greed, refusal to acknowledge that his time had passed and new leadership was necessary. He kept moving closer, drawn by the promise of witnessing Marchetti's defeat personally. His security team followed, maintaining protective formation but increasingly focused on the warehouse entrance rather than perimeter security. They were professionals, but professionals who'd been told to expect victory, not ambush. "Take me to him," Victor commanded. "Show me where he's hiding." I turned back toward the warehouse, leading Victor and 4 of his security personnel inside. The lighting was poor, damaged fixtures creating pools of shadow that obscured clear sightlines. Perfect conditions for what Marchetti had planned. We were 15 feet inside when everything happened simultaneously. Federal agents burst through the warehouse's rear entrances, announcing themselves with the trained authority of people who'd conducted hundreds of raids. Marchetti's people dropped their pretense of weakness, weapons appearing from concealed positions to create crossfire that left Victor's security team with no viable defensive options. "Federal agents, drop your weapons," the lead agent commanded, his voice amplified through a megaphone. "You are all under arrest for violations of federal racketeering statutes, drug trafficking, and attempted murder." Victor's expression cycled through disbelief, rage, and something that might have been grudging respect. His hand moved toward his jacket, reaching for whatever weapon he'd brought to this confrontation, but I was already moving. The self-defense training I'd taken years ago, partly for peace of mind in New York, but mostly because my mother had insisted, manifested in muscle memory. I stepped inside his reach, struck his wrist with enough force to disrupt his grip, and used his own momentum to send him stumbling into the arms of waiting federal agents. The entire encounter lasted maybe 30 seconds. By the time Victor had processed what happened, he was face down on the concrete floor. Federal agents securing his wrists with zip ties while reading him rights he'd spent years believing didn't apply to people like him. Marchetti emerged from his defensive position, moving toward me with an expression of such profound relief I felt tears threatening. "You took a terrible risk," he said quietly, his hands checking me for injuries despite the obvious lack of blood or damage. "You taught me to recognize when tactical deception creates strategic advantage." This seemed like an appropriate application of the principle. Walsh approached, flanked by agents who'd secured the warehouse's perimeter. "We have 17 people in custody," she announced. "Victor Castellano, his security team, and several individuals wanted on outstanding warrants. This is going to make one hell of a press conference." "And the immunity agreements? Still valid. You delivered everything you promised and then some. The evidence we've collected here today, combined with the files you provided earlier, gives us enough to prosecute Castellano on multiple charges that carry life sentences." "What about the corrupt officials? The political connections he was relying on for protection? Already being brought in for questioning?" "Turns out your psychological assessment of who would flip was remarkably accurate. We have 3 plea agreements in process, each one providing testimony about additional corruption. By tomorrow morning, we'll have arrest warrants for 2 city councilmen, a state senator, and at least 1 federal employee who should have known better." Victor was being led toward a waiting transport vehicle. His expensive suit rumpled from being face-planted into concrete, his usual composure shattered by the recognition that his carefully constructed empire had collapsed in a matter of hours. As he passed, he looked directly at me with an expression of pure hatred. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice carrying the kind of promise that sent ice through my veins. "Both of you. My people don't forget. My organization doesn't disappear just because I'm in custody. Someone will finish what I started." "Your organization's already gone," Marchetti replied calm. "While you've been focused on me, federal agents have been executing warrants across the city. Your distribution network, your political contacts, your financial operations, all of it being systematically dismantled as we speak. By tomorrow, there won't be enough left of your empire to threaten anyone." The finality in his voice seemed to deflate Victor's remaining defiance. He was led away in silence, leaving behind a warehouse full of federal agents collecting evidence and crime scene investigators documenting what had happened. Walsh pulled Marchetti aside for detailed debriefing while I stood near the communications center, processing everything that had occurred. In the space of less than a week, my entire life had been deconstructed and rebuilt into something unrecognizable. I'd gone from anonymous waitress to federal witness to active participant in organized crime prosecution. The woman I'd been before Restaurante Lucia might as well have been a different person, someone whose concerns and ambitions seemed impossibly small from my current perspective. "You did good today," Vincent said, approaching with his usual professional courtesy. "Not many civilians could maintain composure under that kind of pressure. You've got the instincts for this work being criminal psychology consultation for organized crime family, being whatever you need to be to survive in situations most people can't imagine. That's rarer than you think." The debriefing lasted hours. Federal agents wanted detailed accounts of everything that had happened, every decision made, every piece of intelligence that had led to Victor's capture. One provided my observations about psychological patterns and behavioral predictions, explaining how I had identified vulnerabilities in Victor's organization that made the prosecution strategy viable. By the time Walsh released us, evening had fallen over Brooklyn. The warehouse was still swarming with federal personnel, but Marchetti and I were free to leave under the terms of our immunity agreements. Vincent drove us back to Manhattan in silence, both of us too exhausted for conversation, processing the day's events with the kind of numb detachment that comes after sustained adrenaline finally crashes. "We need somewhere safe to stay," Marchetti said as we crossed back into Manhattan. "The penthouse isn't secure. Victor's people might still attempt something before they realize their organization has collapsed." We ended up at a hotel in Midtown, one of the anonymous luxury establishments that catered to business travelers who valued discretion over personality. The suite Vincent secured was elegant in that generic way that suggested professional interior designers working from corporate guidelines rather than personal vision. But it was safe, which was all that mattered after the day we'd survived. Marchetti stood at the window overlooking the city, his reflection ghostly in the glass, shoulders carrying tension that wouldn't fully release for days. I approached slowly, giving him space to process everything that had happened, while also offering my presence as comfort if he wanted it. 7 years, he said quietly. 7 years I'd been preparing for someone to come after me the way Victor did. 7 years of expecting every meal to be my last, every meeting to be an ambush, every relationship to be a potential vulnerability someone would exploit. And it ends in a Brooklyn warehouse with federal agents instead of a bullet. Somehow that feels anticlimactic. Would you have preferred the bullet? His laugh was short and bitter. Some days, yes. At least that would have been definitive. This surviving to face consequences and questions in the complicated aftermath. This requires actually living instead of just existing between crises. I moved to stand beside him, our reflections merging in the window glass. "You've been existing instead of living since Katerina died. Maybe this is your chance to figure out the difference. And what if I don't remember how? What if 7 years of calculated survival has eroded whatever capacity I once had for normal human connection? Then I'll teach. The same way you taught me to navigate your world, to read tactical situations, to make decisions under pressure. We'll figure it out together." He turned to face me directly, his hands finding my waist with the kind of careful gentleness that suggested he was still processing that I was real and alive and choosing to stay despite everything I'd witnessed. "You could walk away now. Victor's in custody, his organization's dismantled. You've fulfilled your obligations under the immunity agreement. Nothing ties you to my world anymore except choice. Is that what you want? For me to walk away? What I want is irrelevant compared to what you deserve. You deserve a life that doesn't involve federal prosecutions and warehouse shootouts and the constant awareness that someone might decide you know too much and need to be eliminated. But that's not the life I want anymore. I spent 28 years being safe and invisible and following all the rules that keep people like me comfortably irrelevant, and I was dying, Dante. Not physically like my mother, but dying in all the ways that matter. Dying of predictability and unfulfilled potential and the soul-crushing awareness that nothing I did would ever really matter. Until you walked into Ristorante Lucia and threw a wine glass at my feet because you were testing whether I'd react with fear or dignity. Until I whispered your dead wife's name and saw you recognize that I understood pain you'd never articulated to anyone. Until I discovered that everything I'd been trained to do, all those skills I thought were academically interesting but practically useless, could actually save lives and stop violence and matter in ways I'd never imagined. You're romanticizing this. In 6 months, when the adrenaline fades and reality sets in, you'll realize that my world is brutal and unforgiving and not compatible with the kind of future you probably imagined for yourself. Then let me romanticize it for 6 months. Let me make this choice with full awareness that I might regret it later. Because right now, in this moment, I've never felt more alive or more certain that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. When he kissed me this time, it carried different weight than our previous encounters. Not the desperate urgency of people seeking comfort in crisis, but the deliberate commitment of two people choosing each other despite impossible circumstances. His hands tangled in my hair, pulling me closer as if proximity could somehow merge us into a single entity that couldn't be separated by danger or doubt. We made love slowly, carefully, taking time to map each other's bodies with the kind of attention that suggested we were memorizing something precious. The urgency of survival had given way to the luxury of present moment awareness. The recognition that we'd earned this peace through violence and strategy, and the particular courage required to be vulnerable with another person. Afterward, we lay tangled in hotel sheets that would be changed by morning staff who'd never know what had happened within them. Marchetti's fingers traced patterns across my bare shoulder, following paths only he could see, creating a kind of intimacy that went deeper than physical connection. "Tell me about your mother," he said quietly. "Not how she died. Tell me about who she was when she was healthy and full of life." Again, the quest surprised me with its specificity. "She was fierce," I said, searching for words adequate to capture her essence. "Fierce in the way that immigrant women often are. The ones who've sacrificed everything familiar for the possibility of something better. She came to Brooklyn speaking maybe 20 words of English and built an entire life through sheer determination and refusal to accept limitations. She worked 3 jobs for the first 5 years, cleaning offices at night, working retail during the day, taking in sewing on weekends. She'd come home exhausted and still make proper calibrous meals because she insisted that maintaining culture was resistance against the forces that wanted us to forget where we came from. She taught me Italian because she said language was identity, and people who lost their language eventually lost themselves. When I got into college, she cried for 3 days. Not sad tears, but the kind of overwhelming emotion that comes from achieving something you'd worked your entire life to make possible. She'd sit in the back of my psychology lectures when her work schedule allowed, just to witness me learning. She didn't understand half of what the professors discussed, but she understood that her daughter was building a future she'd never had access to. And then she got sick, and everything she'd built started collapsing. The medical bills consumed our savings within 6 months. She had to quit her jobs because treatment left her too weak to work. Insurance companies found creative ways to deny coverage for procedures they'd initially approved. We sold everything we owned of value, and it still wasn't enough. Near the end, when the pain was constant and dignity was a luxury she could no longer afford, she made me promise I'd do something meaningful with my life. She said she hadn't sacrificed everything just so I could play it safe and comfortable. She wanted me to take risks, to find purposes worth fighting for, to matter in ways that extended beyond my own personal comfort. Marchetti was silent for a long moment, processing the story with the kind of focused attention that suggested he understood the weight of deathbed promises. Katerina made me promise something similar. She knew what I was, knew the violence I'd committed and would commit again, but she made me promise that when she was gone, I'd find a way to protect people instead of just hurting. She said power without purpose was just cruelty disguised as necessity. I tried after she died. Tried to honor that promise by being more selective about which conflicts I engaged in, by protecting neighborhood businesses from predatory criminals, by using my influence to prevent violence instead of causing it. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of the distinction. Everything became tactical necessity. Every decision was calculated for survival rather than meaning. And then you showed up at my table speaking Italian you weren't supposed to understand. Seeing pain I'd spent 7 years trying to hide, offering understanding I didn't think anyone could provide any. You reminded me that Katerina's promise wasn't about specific actions. It was about remaining human enough to recognize when someone needed help and choosing to provide it, even when it created complications. So we both made promises to dead women that shaped who we became. And maybe honoring those promises means building something together, something that acknowledges the violence of my world while also creating spaces for the kind of meaningful impact your mother wanted you to achieve. What would that even look like? Marchetti sat up, reaching for his phone on the nightstand. I've been thinking about this since the warehouse, since watching you analyze Victor's organization and identifying vulnerabilities that prevented God knows how much additional violence. Your skills, your ability to read people and predict behavior, that's not just valuable for prosecuting criminals, it's valuable for preventing crimes before they happen. You want me to work for you permanently. We discussed this before. Not work for me, work with me. Partner in building something different than traditional organized crime. Use my resources and connections to identify situations where intervention could prevent violence. Use your psychological expertise to understand why people make self-destructive choices and provide alternatives before those choices become fatal. It sounds suspiciously like social work disguised as crime prevention. Maybe, but social work funded by someone who understands how power actually operates and isn't constrained by bureaucratic limitations or political consideration. We could do real good, Sophia, not the sanitized, grant-funded, carefully measured good that nonprofits accomplish when they're not busy justifying their existence to donors, but actual intervention that changes outcomes. The vision he was articulating felt simultaneously idealistic and pragmatic, using the infrastructure of organized crime to accomplish objectives that legitimate society couldn't or wouldn't prioritize. It was ethically complicated in ways that would give philosophers migraines, but it was also potentially more effective than conventional approaches. I'd need guarantees, I said, clear boundaries about what kinds of activities I'd be involved in. I'm not participating in violence, even if I understand its necessity in certain contexts. I'm not helping facilitate operations that harm innocent people. And I'm not becoming someone who justifies cruelty through philosophical rationalization. Agreed. Your role would be analysis and intervention, reading people, identifying problems before they escalate, providing alternatives that prevent violence rather than causing it. Have enough people who can handle tactical operations. What I need is someone who can help me make better decisions about which operations are actually necessary. Over the next hours, we sketched out a framework for what this partnership might look like. part consulting firm, part intervention service, operating in the gray spaces between legitimate business and criminal enterprise. I'd maintain nominal independence through a properly established psychology practice while actually working with Marchetti's organization to identify and address situations where my particular skills could prevent harm. It wasn't the future I'd imagined for myself back when I was pouring wine at Ristorante Lucia and dreaming about someday opening my own practice, but those dreams had been built on assumptions about what kind of life was possible, what kinds of impacts were achievable through conventional means. This new vision acknowledged reality's complexity while refusing to accept that complexity as justification for an action. 3 months later, I stood in the office of what was officially known as the Russo Consulting Group, a legitimate behavioral analysis firm serving corporate clients throughout New York. The office was in Midtown, 3 rooms in a renovated building that balanced professional credibility with strategic positioning. Officially, I provided workplace psychology services, conflict resolution, and organizational behavior analysis. Unofficially, I helped Marchetti's organization identify threats, assess potential allies, and develop strategies that minimized violence while protecting legitimate interests. The phone on my desk buzzed with an incoming call from a number I'd learned to recognize. Vincent's voice carried his usual professional courtesy. "We have a situation developing in Queens. Restaurant owner being pressured by local gang to pay protection money. Wants to resist, but doesn't have resources to protect himself. Thought you might want to assess before we determine appropriate response. I'll be there in an hour. Have someone gather background information on the gang members. I want to understand their motivations before we decide how to proceed." After hanging up, I stood at my office window, looking out over the city that had become both workplace and home. Somewhere out there, Marchetti was conducting his own business, maintaining the delicate balance between legitimate enterprise and the shadow world he'd inherited. We'd found a rhythm that worked: personal partnership supporting professional collaboration. My mother's photograph sat on my desk, her expression captured during better times before illness had stolen everything. I thought about her promise, about taking risks and finding purpose and mattering in ways that extended beyond personal comfort. This life I'd built might not look like anything she'd imagined, but it honored the spirit of what she'd wanted. The intercom buzzed again, this time with a different caller. Sophia Marchetti's voice carried warmth beneath professional courtesy. "Dinner tonight? There's something I want to discuss. The same restaurant where we met?" His laugh was genuine, untouched by the cynicism that had colored everything when we'd first encountered each other. "I think we've graduated from that particular location. How about somewhere new? Somewhere that's ours rather than haunted by other people's ghosts? I'd like that." After we disconnected, I found myself smiling at my own reflection in the office window. The woman staring back at me bore little resemblance to the exhausted waitress who'd served wine to difficult customers and dreamed about someday having a life that mattered. That woman had been afraid of risk, convinced that safety was the highest achievement available to someone from her background. This woman understood that safety was an illusion people constructed to avoid acknowledging how fragile existence really was. This woman had whispered a dead wife's name to a dangerous man and discovered that vulnerability could be strength when offered at exactly the right moment. This woman had walked into federal buildings and warehouse shootouts with equal composure because she'd finally found purposes worth fighting for. Downstairs, Vincent waited with the car that would take me to Queens, to the restaurant owner who needed help he couldn't afford through conventional means. Tomorrow there would be other situations. Other people caught between impossible choices. Other opportunities to apply the skills I'd spent years developing without understanding their ultimate purpose. This was the life my mother had wanted for me. Dangerous, meaningful, full of the kind of impact that couldn't be measured in conventional metrics, but could be felt in lives saved and violence prevented. And this was the life Caterina had wanted for Marchetti, using his power to protect rather than simply dominate, finding redemption through action rather than remaining paralyzed by grief. We'd both honored our promises to women who'd loved us enough to demand we become our best selves. And in doing so, we'd found each other, built something neither of us could have created alone, and discovered that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships produce the most transformative results. The city stretched out before me, millions of lives intersecting in patterns too complex for any single person to fully comprehend. But I was learning to read those patterns, to identify the critical moments where intervention could shift trajectories from destructive to redemptive. It was the work I'd been training for my entire life without realizing it. And tonight, over dinner at a restaurant that wasn't haunted by ghosts, I'd continue building this improbable future with a man who'd learned that love wasn't betrayal of the past, but honor of everyone, who'd believed we were capable of becoming more than our worst moments. The phone buzzed one final time, a text from Marchetti, just 2 words that carried more weight than entire conversations. "Thank you." I typed my response with steady fingers. No longer the woman who'd trembled while cleaning broken glass from marble floors. Always together. Outside my window, New York continued its eternal dance. And somewhere in that vast urban landscape, another story was beginning. Another person was facing impossible choices. Another opportunity was emerging for intervention that might prevent tragedy. Tomorrow I'd find them. Tonight I'd celebrate surviving long enough to build a life worth living. This was who I'd become. Not despite the violence and danger and moral complexity, but because of them. The woman who'd responded perfectly when a mafia boss insulted her in Italian, who'd whispered the name of his dead wife with compassion instead of fear, and who'd discovered that sometimes the most dangerous choice is also the only one worth making.